Horn of Africa number 6. An independent journal. Eritrea. The roots of war. European colonial rule and the transformation of Eritrean rural life. Acknowledgements. On April 26, 1983, a seminar, Eritrea, The Roots of War, was held at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, New Jersey. Professor Kasahun Chikole of Rutgers University organized and chaired the day-long session. We appreciate his tireless efforts to pull it off so well. The seminar was co-sponsored by the African STU and NTS Cultural Affairs and Programs Committee, Paul Robeson Cultural Center, Department of African Studies in collaboration with Africa Resec and Publications Project and Research and Center on Eritrea. Also, Professors Eric Davis, Alan Howard, Meredith Tershan, said estimator made valuable corner one ants on seminar papers. Ms. Lenora Williams, a journalist, gave an eyewitness account of her recent visit in areas under the control of the Eritrean People's Liberation Front. To all, our deeply felt gratitude. Richard Astro, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Boston University, and Dr. Ozzie Edwards, coordinator of the African American Studies Department of Northeastern University, MOVIND funds for editing the proceedings of the Seminx Catherine Cantrell of the African American Studies Department the Palksras. WC appreciate her skills and patience. I'm also grateful for the and cooperation that the Research and Information Center on Eritrea gave me while working on the manuscripts. Arayat Tsege, Coordinator Office in the USA, was helpful in many ways. I say, thank you to all of the participants and contributors. Jordan Gabramedin. Introduction to the proceedings of the seminar on Eritrea. Jordan Gabramedin. Since the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, the Horn of Africa has known no peace. By 1880 it became a focus of confrontation between local and international powers who were competing for this strategically important region. Prior to this period, the region's population was overwhelmingly rural. Society, economics, politics, and ideology were fragmented along regional lines since no coherent state or defined geopolitical territory existed. By the early 20th century, Italy created Eritrea and Italian Somaliland, the British controlled British Somaliland, the French had French Somaliland, Djibouti, and Menelik Il expanded his reign south, southwest, southeast and north to create the Ethiopian Empire. The process of uprooting and exploiting the rural population had begun with the Italians, British, French and the Showans interlocked in an intense struggle to control the region. Although the penetration and impact of these takeovers were uneven and differed from area to area, the cumulative CT on the Eritrean population was profound. The following essays are meant to illuminate the complex history of Eritrea, as a country abused by Ethiopian tyrants, as a symbol of weakness in international law, and most importantly, as a heroic people struggling against all odds to establish a just and independent society. European capitalist colonialism and Showan feudal conquest affected the local traditional social formations differently. Europeans' rule broke up the pre-capitalist social and economic arrangements and created a modern infrastructure which undermined traditional rule by replacing it with the rudiments of modern national politics. The Showan expansion, on the other hand, tried to consolidate feudal relationships. In both cases, national politics developed quite distinctly. With the defeat of Italy in 1941, the balance of power shifted in the region. Italian Eritrea came under British rule from 1941 to 1952, and then was nominally federated with Ethiopia by a United Nations resolution from 1952 to 1962. Finally, Ethiopia annexed and reduced it to a province in 1962. Under the impact of Italian and British colonialism, a distinct of Eritrean national politics, transcending regional and tribal differences, emerged. But the Ethiopian rule halted this democratic experience. The logical outcome was the continuation of political struggle by other means. Thus, the armed struggle for independence was born in 1961. Until 1974, the bulk of the scholarly interest in the Horn of Africa focused on Ethiopia and ignored the impact of European and Shoan rule on Eritrea. The annexation of Eritrea by Ethiopia in 1962 was seen as a natural reunion of a lost territory with its Ethiopian motherland. However, by the 1970s, resistance against the Ethiopian Empire State was evident not only in Eritrea, but also in Tigray, the Oromo area, and Ogaden. Because of these developments, a revised assessment of the region became essential. The purpose of the Rutgers seminar was, therefore, to use Eritrea as a focal point in analyzing the incorporation of the Horn of Africa into the world capitalist system. It is perhaps not an exaggeration to claim that the zace and prosperity of the entire region depends upon a just solution to the Eritrean problem. The argument that Eritrea has always been pan of Ethiopia only begs the issue. The same socio-economic forces that created nation-states in the Horn of Africa also created the Ethiopian Empire State. Unable to deal with the burden of an empire it created, the Ethiopian state has, since its birth, been consumed by anarchy and repression. The incorporation of Eritrea into the empire in 1962 exemplified the accelerated erosion of CONFKKNCC and strength of the monarchy. By 1974, the cumulative effect of this burden of an Perks resulted in the fall of the Ethiopian monarchy. To this end, the important role played by the Eritrean armed struggle must be appreciated. At present, he inheritors or the Empire State, the Ethiopian DCRG, are faced, in addition to the Eritrean armed struggle, with formidable armed opposition throughout the country. It is important to understand the basis of Eritrean national consciousness. The contribution by Jordan Gebremethuen is a modest theoretical attempt to understand and locate the key socio-economic factors that gave rise to the National Liberation War in Eritrea. With the traditional rural population of the country continuously being dispossessed and exploited, a common experience of production and production relations developed in Eritrea. Italy conducted two major wars using Eritrea as a base. Ariatsege has analyzed the economic effects of these wars on Eritrean political economy in a well-researched forthcoming work. The present essay, entitled Independent Eritrea, Economically Viable, summarizes the main arguments against the independence of Eritrea, that the country is poor and not self-sufficient. He then surveys the actual and potential wealth of the country and shows that, with capable political leadership, independent Eritrea could be economically viable and contribute modestly to the development of the region. The author of The Eritrean Question in International Law is a well-known Africanist scholar, presently doing research on the Horn of Africa as well as on human rights in Africa as a whole, including the human right to basic needs. His two books, Conflict and Intervention in the Horn of Africa and Behind the War in Eritrea, co-authored, are mandatory reading for those who want to familiarize themselves with these complex issues. Dr. Bitekit H. Selassie is one of the most important authorities on Imperial Ethiopia, as he has held various positions in Haile Selassie's government, including the post of Attorney General and Mayor of Harar. Banished by Haile Selassie's government for his radical views, Dr. Bitekit H. Selassie has achieved what every Eritrean intellectual cherishes: he is now considered public enemy number I by the Ethiopian military government. With enemies like that, is to have friends. His have exposed the jugular vein of Imperial Ethiopia. He is inspiration to young scholars, and we may happy to his mticle in this pair. The legal arguments in the Eritrean case are summarized am there imxertatsion and related in this article. The fourth and final essay begins with the 1940s. After World War I, the balance of world shifted from Western to Thai United States and the Soviet Union. The temporary united front of the West and the East to fight fascism was replaced by the cold politics and proxy military confrontation the United States and the Soviet Union in the Third World. The CWERUM created by the decolonization of the Horn of Africa and the Middle East generated Condilians FTY confrontations. Creation of Israel exacerbated the situation and helped the active alignment and realignment of regimes in region from to another. Although the role of the United States has studied, tier Soviet Unions has ina and Quadali and alt with. In this original article, Taki Fessa Hatzian has written a well-documented diplomatic history of Eritrea. East/West rivalries over Eritrea, the alignment and realignment of Ethiopia with Visius for its control of Eritrea has, as Taki shows, a long history. His research is based extensive work done in London, in the UN Library in New York, and on information gathered through the U.S. Freedom of Information Act. He has synthesized original sources and has presented a fine work on the diplomatic history. Ever since the defeat of the Italians during the last World War and their eventual departure from the foreign policy of Ethiopia has been dominated by one issue, Eritrea. Specifically, Ethiopia's relations with foreign governments. In eluding the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, often unencumbered by has tranbate on the extent to which such reliance served Ethiopia's vital interest, first inquiring, then holding onto Eritrea. The overthrow of the monarchy by army officers in 1975 did not significantly change Ethiopia's conduct of foreign policy in regard to Eritrea. Even though Ethiopia's foreign policy posture has been most *able FCR its remarkable constancy over the years, since the early 1940s Ethiopia's diplomatic activity has nevertheless gone through 4 phases, each phase defining a period of close collaboration between Ethiopia and one or two of the major world powers in pursuit of Ethiopia's ultimate zero objective in Eritrea, the first phase right after the defeat of the Italians during World War I, when Emperor Haile Selassie initiated his claims on Eritrea, first to the British and then to the Allied powers that convened to decide the fate of Eritrea and the other former Italian colonies. The second phase excluded the involvement of the United Nations in search of a solution to the Eritrean issue, which resulted in the 1950 UN resolution that created the Ethiopian Eritrea Federation. The third phase covered the Ethiopian government's systematic effort to devitalize the autochthonous existence of Eritrea, and which culminated with the abrogation of the Ethiopian Eritrean Federation in 1962. The fourth and current phase has included the demise of Haile Selassie's government and its replacement by a socialist military junta, and the subsequent internationalization of the Eritrean question. The paradoxical features of this phase include, a socialist government in Ethiopia engaged in a brutal war of suppression in Eritrea to uphold a territorial policy whose architect was none other than the discredited government of Secretary Haile Selassie, and, 2. The Soviet Union and Cuba arrayed in Eritrea on the side of the Ethiopian military junta against Eritrean liberation movements whose goal of independence and self-determination they subvert in the past. Thus, what emerges from an examination of Ethiopian foreign policy over the last 40-odd years is the striking test between the Eritrean goals of Ethiopia and socialist Ethiopia. Also, the analytical map of the Horn of Africa would have been different from the current if it had trend for the diplomatic and material support Ethiopia received from the major BWCRS during critical stages of the Eritrean campaign. Phase 1, 1941 to 1952, less than a year after Italy declared war on Britain on June 10. 1940, British and Allied forces drove Italy out of Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somaliland. On April 1941, Asmara fell, and a few days later the occupation of Eritrea by British Commonwealth forces was completed. A new administering authority, the British Military Administration of Eritrea, was put in place to take over the civil administration of the former Italian colony. Another contingent of British and Allied forces moved south to Ethiopia and reinstated Emperor Haile Selassie in his capital, Addis Ababa. 6 weeks later, on June 14, 1941, the Ernv Rohr sent a telegram to Prime Minister Churchill requesting that Britain use its good offices to expedite the return of Eritrea a year later. April 18, 1942, the Ethiopian government sent another official MTE to Great Britain reiterating Ethiopia's claim to Eritrea. Gist of the note was that Ethiopia was hopeful that at the end of the war Great Britain would do its utmost to secure the return of Eritrea to the Ethiopian Empire. The basis of the claim, which would be repeated numerous times in subsequent years, included the alleged historical link between Ethiopia and Eritrea. The note also stated that since Eritrea was taken illegally by the Italians from Ethiopia, the territory should be returned to its rightful owner, Ethiopia. The Foreign Office in London instructed the British legation in Addis Ababa to review and assess the validity of the claims contained in the April 18 Ethiopian diplomatic note. An etnorandum prepared by E.A. Chapman Andrews of the British Tea Station concentrated on 2 points raised in the Ethiopian note: historical and legal facts. The memorandum made several points that throughout her history Eritrea changed hands many times, and portions of what is now Eritrea were ruled at one time or another by the Arabs, Turks, Egyptians, and Italians. In response to the legal issue raised in the Ethiopian note, the memorandum, the importance of the two treaties, Uchiali, 1889, and Addis Ababa, lies in the incontrovertible fact that they were freely regateated by Menelik, the undoubted master of the united Ethiopia in his hour of triumph. In them were fixed the frontiers between Eritrea and Ethiopia, and the frontiers stood until the Italo-Ethiopian War, 1934–36. It will be observed that Agirtad, Karen and Azumra are well within the Italian boundary. It follows, therefore, that on treaty or juridical grounds the Emperor Menelik's successors can have no claim on Eritrea. Emphasis added, though the Chapman-Andrews Memorandum was emphatic in its rejection of Ethiopian claims based on history and international law, it suggested that there may be other factors that would have to be considered before Ethiopia's claim is ultimately settled. The Ethiopian claim to Eritrea cannot settled now, though it will have to be faced one day. Tricky questions of geography, race, religion, language, culture, economics, and higher politics, which have hardly touched upon in this, will then have to be most carefully weighed. Of all the tricky questions alluded to in the memorandum, the imperatives of higher politics would ultimately guide and inform British resolution of the Eritrean question. On the Chapman-Andrews note, the Foreign Office advised the Ethiopian government that Ethiopia's claim can only be properly at the settlement, and that it would impossible for the United Kingdom government to give assurances to Ethiopia regarding the future of Eritrea. The Foreign Office LSKCD the eminent historian, AJ then with its research department, to prepare a entailed study of the Eritrean issue and prepare his recommendations on the future of the territory. Toynov presented two sets of proposals, L. that Beni Amr should be ceded to the Sudan, and, 2. that of THC victorious powers, Toynbee did specify which, should occupy Massawa and the hinterland. If, for some reason, the two proposals were acceptable, Toynbee had an alternative plan which would cede the whole, or a large part, of Eritrea to Ethiopia for a suitable quid pro quo. Yet, the noted historian was unmindful of tier legal complications inherent in any scheme that put pawns to all or part of Eritrea to Ethiopia. In his memorandum to the Foreign Office, it, incorporating Eritrea into Ethiopia, has a juridical weakness in that approximately the present frontier was first conceded to Italy by the Emperor Menelik at a time when he had defeated an Italian army in the field, and therefore could not plead that he was signing the treaty UNN Arduris. 6. Yet, in spite of the juridical wedrovses of his proposal to cede Eritrea to Ethiopia, nevertheless proceeded to argue, but in spite of this alienation on Abyssinian rights, by Menelik, it would practically be, Sipk, if Tir Emperor were asked to cede the Ogaden region as a contribution to the Greater Somalia project, and the Sudan at own cost to himself, to withhold from him the mountain core of Eritrea and an outlet to the EA were discussed in depth within the various end partants of the Foreign Office during most of the 1943–1944 as a result of Deletekratens, Tir Foreign Office, in May 1944, formulated Elan M1TS of a possible quid pro quo with Ethiopia. If it were decided to ask the Emperor to relinquish the whole province of Ogaden with PXTS of Harar and Bale, a strip of territory along Kenya frontier Moyle, and Tayabaro Triangle in the west, it might thought Rex sorry to offer him in full sovereignty all of those parts of Eritrea to which he will attach particular importance the area. The Dan Alku Mry and Massawa. If strategic side rations were to preclude the offer of Massawa, it might be necessary to lighten the other of the scale accordingly the colonial office. 2. A dum that stressed the strategic value of Eritrea and the importance of ensuring that Eritrea not fall into enemy hands. In hostile hands it may block communications through the Red Sea to various ports of the British Empire, and if used as a stepping to Abyssinian Mountains bastion, may constitute a threat to the of Eastern AF. Thus, WH's position should Great Britain ADGN in negotiations on the future of Eritrea. The Colonial Office's recommendations was not significantly different from the Foreign Office's. According to the Colonial Office, Britain may decide to offer a part of it, eritrea, to the Ernfekir in order to provide him with an outlet to the sea. If this is adopted, the imperance of using IRSA and Zergening level for the Volume 6, Number 2 Horn of Africa/9 purpose of securing frontier rectifications should on no account be neglected. Emphasis added. Combined recommendations of the Foreign and Colonial Offices were submitted to the Chiefs of Staff of the Armed Forces for their comment. Since Britain was in the midst of a war, it was to solicit the advice of the British Military Command to assess the strategic value of Eritrea. The Chiefs of Staff stressed the strategic importance of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Red Sea. On trade disposal of Eritrea, Chiefs agreed with the recommendations of the Foreign and Colonial Offices. Reiterating the importance of denying Massawa and Asmara to potential enemies and underline the need for keeping these two population centers under British control. The Cairo Conference, February, 1945 For Angmor Haile Selassie, the issue of the return of Eritrea was the most pressing. Ever since the Mfekir was returned to Ethiopia by British and Commonwealth forces, Haile Selassie persisted in staking his claim to Eritrea. The basis for the claim was SRXLLED out in a memorandum the Emperor submitted to Prime Minister Churchill during their Cairo, Egypt, meeting on February 1945. In an memorandum, Ethiopia argued that with the forfeiture of Italian rule Eritrea should revert to its foreign and rightful owner. And the memorandum went the previously stated justifications based on the alleged shared experiences and history of the peoples of Ethiopia and Eritrea. It introduced two entirely new reasons why Eritrea should revert to its rightful owner. The memorandum argued that Ethiopia deserved to acquire Eritrea partly as a compensation to redress in part the injustices visited Ethiopia by the fascist regime. Ethiopia deserved access to the sea because of the cruel exhaust the hostilities of 1935-36, when, for purely political reasons Ethiopia was denied the importation of the necessary arms for prosecuting the war against the Italian invader. This should sufficiently demonstrate urgency of this vital need. Ethiopia. The memorandum also alluded, indirectly, to Britain's self-serving neutrality during Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, despite the Emperor's appeal for help from the League of Nations, of which both Ethiopia and Great Britain were members. Churchill was not able to respond affirmatively to Ethiopia's request for Eritrea. He informed that though Britain was sympathetic to the Emperor's claim, the decision of the disposal of the former Italian colonies was not up to Britain alone. Eritrea and other post-war issues would be the subject of an upcoming peace conference in Paris, and it would be up to the Allied powers to decide what to do with Eritrea. The Paris Peace Conference. The Paris Peace Conference, held between July 29 and October 1946, was attended by the 4 Allied powers and 16 other invited countries, including Ethiopia and Italy. At the conference, Ethiopia made her oft-repeated claim that Eritrea was a lost province of Ethiopia and that the Allied powers should return Eritrea to her mother, Ethiopia. Italy wanted to return to her former colonies as a trustee, to prove to the people of Italy that their democratically elected government was indeed a respected member of the Western Alliance. France and the Soviet Union supported Italy, though for different reasons. The Soviet Union proposed that in Tripolitania, Libya, both Italy and the Soviet Union should be co-trustees, adding that the United States and Britain should establish a trusteeship authority over the rest of Eritrea. The United States, however, insisted that Eritrea become after 10 years of British trusteeship. As in the London Conference the year before, the foreign ministers of the Allied powers again were mired in an impasse they could not break. Thus sidestepping the colonies issue, the envoys ratified a peace treaty with Italy on February 10, 1947. The treaty forced Italy to renounce all titles and rights to its former colonies, and the disposal of the former colonies was left in the hands of the Allied powers. The Allied powers decided to send a commission of investigation to Eritrea to ascertain the needs and wishes of the territory and to seek appropriate solutions to the disposal of the territory. Whatever may said of Haile Selassie's substantial failings as a leader of his Rappel, in regard to this objective on Eritrea, his achievement was extraordinaire. He was always the consummate diplomat, and he orchestrated a series of apt political maneuverings that, in the end, culminated in the annexation of Eritrea in 1962. Haile Selassie framed the Eritrean question in such a way that informed world public opinion was sympathetic to his objective. That the late was able to sway public opinion to his side was, in large part, due to Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia in 1936 and Haile Selassie's subsequent feudal address at the League of Nations, pleading with members of the League to take positive steps to stop Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia. In his address in Geneva, Haile Selassie cut a sympathetic yet heroic figure. Though the League ignored his request, public opinion and editorial writers in Europe and the US rallied to his side, since his country was inarguably a victim of fascist Aggression. Mussolini's invasion generated a groundswell of sympathy for Ethiopia, which Haile Selassie skillfully exploited to promote his ambition of acquiring Eritrea. Thus, after the war, Ethiopia pressed her claim in regard to Eritrea in the name of justice, reminding the world that Ethiopia should not be denied justice twice, and that the big powers had a moral responsibility to acknowledge Ethiopia's claim. Ethiopia's main diplomatic effort during the late 40s was to press claim herself or through third parties, and simultaneously to engage in a rearguard fight to squelch any ideas or plan that envisaged granting independence for Eritrea. The Four-Power Commission of Inquiry. The Four-Power Commission stayed in Eritrea from November 12, 1947 until January 3, 1948. Its mandate was to collect necessary data on the economic/political/social condition, as well as the wishes and welfare of the people of Eritrea. The findings of the Commission were intended to be used by the Council of Foreign Ministers of the Four Powers to assist them in their deliberations toward their search for an acceptable solution to the former colonies issue. The Commission members, one from each of the four-power countries, went to Eritrea with acceptable predispositions as to how the Eritrean question should be resolved. Commission members disagreed among themselves in their interpretation of the facts they collected in Eritrea, and consequently, the final report they submitted to the Council of Foreign Ministers at their meeting in Lancaster reflected the deep schism among the Commission members. The UK's Deputy Foreign Minister expressed his governance preference that the whole of Eritrea be placed under Ethiopian for 10 years, at the end of which Eritreans would decide their own future. The US and French delegates proposed to partition Eritrea with the of Assab going to Ethiopia. In the United States plan, any resolution of the remaining part of Eritrea, including Asmara, Misawa, and the Western Province, would be postponed for 1 year. The French suggested that Italy administer the remaining portion of Eritrea. 13. The Russian delegate stood before his colleagues to defend the accomplishments of Italian colonialism, and particularly its civilizing mission in Eritrea. He presented the Soviet government's proposal that Italy be permitted back in Eritrea as a trustee power so as to able to do the good work Italians had sown during the previous years. The Soviet delegation has studied very carefully and closely this question, and having in mind the great progress and extensive work which has been done by the Italian government in this colony during their administration as to industry and agriculture, and having also in mind the enormous work carried out in connection with transport in this colony, and bearing in mind the statement made publicly by the Italian spokesman that the Italian government would do its best to improve the standard of living and well-being of the Eritrean population, the Soviet delegation considers that Eritrea should be given under the trusteeship of Italy for a definite and acceptable period of time. 16. As has been discussed above, The Four Powers, Volume 6, No. 2 Horn of Africa /11 OEE again, could RNT agree about what to do with Eritrea. On September 15, 1948, the four powers advised the Secretary-General of the United Nations that according to the terms of the Treaty of Peace with Italy, the of Italy's former colonies, including Eritrea, was being referred to the General Assembly of the United Nations for its consideration. Phase 2, 1948 to 1952, at the United Nations, the General Assembly of the United Nations addressed the issue of Eritrea on September 21, 1948, and immediately forwarded it to the First Committee, which was given the unenviable task of finding a solution that has eluded the four powers for 4 years. The First Committee formally took the Italian colonies issue on April 5, 1949 and submitted its recommendation to the General Assembly for its consideration. The recommendation was rejected 37 to 14, with 7 abstentions, in favor of the plan to partition Eritrea between Ethiopia and the Sudan. The General Assembly recommended that the issue of the former colonies taken up at its next, 4th, regular session. On 1949, the 4th session of the General Assembly began to consider the recommendations of its first committee on the question of former Italian colonies. The debates on Eritrea revolved around 3 possible solutions for the territory: independence, partial incorporation into Ethiopia, and international trusteeship. The cast of characters active on the Eritrean question did not significantly change from before. The same parties or governments pushed for the same solutions they had favored in the past. However, there was important change. The Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries, in a dramatic ATX3UT face, now demanded that Eritrea be given independence immediately. Less than a year earlier, at the Lancaster House Conference, Soviet delegate presented his government's proposal that Italy allowed back into Eritrea as a trustee power to continue the positive contributions she had made to Eritrean society for about 60 years. In the General Assembly, the Soviet delegate, Mr. Erudi Union, condemned Italian colonialism with the same fervor his compatriot * praised it earlier at Lancaster House in 1948. This Soviet espousal of Eritrean independence at the General Assembly in November 1949 was more a reflection of Soviet disappointment with Italy's decision to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in 1942, and had less to do with the Soviet Union's sudden discovery of the Eritrean people's right to self-determination, as the Soviet delegate repeatedly invoked. The Soviet on Eritrea, even though it revealed more twists and was fundamentally similar to that pursued by other major powers, including the United States and Great Britain. For all of them, the overriding leitmotif was the advancement of their particular geopolitical concerns, regardless of tier lip service they paid to safeguarding the interests and wiles of the Eritrean people. Ethiopia was represented at the 4th session by Air Foreign Minister, Mr. Aklalu Habtwald. In his address to the Assembly, Mr. Aklalu took pains to differentiate the imperialism of Italy, the United Kingdom and France. He commended Britain and France for following a just and literal in their imperialist practices, and then, inexplicably, he declared that, as of 1949, neither Great Britain nor France had an empire in Africa. He then proceeded to fend the United States, the United Kingdom and France from the Soviet delegates' charge that the 3 powers were practitioners of realism, the great powers, which had been accused of imperialism, namely the United States, the United Kingdom and France, were the very countries which had made the first move in the Assembly in a campaign to bring to an end the unhappy Peri-Cl of in Africa. In Mr. Aklalu's political lexicon, Italy was the only imperialist country in Africa in the late 40s, though this was the *Riot al-Renas. The entire continent was ruled either by Great Britain or France. When he realized that a sizable portion of the delegates were leaning toward voting for an independent Eritrea, the Ethiopian foreign minister lashed out at Italy. He argued that lurking behind the advocacy for Eritrea was a sinister Italian plot to create a puppet government in Eritrea. To him, an independent Eritrea was an absurdity. Nobody in the assembly would go so far as to say that the poor territory of Eritrea and its inhabitants were capable of leading an independent existence. The territory has neither the economic resources, the necessary trained poor Sonal, nor the essential foundations of political unity. And if by some misguided action Eritrea were granted independence, Aklala warned that the outcome for Eritrea would be catastrophic. The immediate and inescapable result of such a step would be revolution, disorder, bloodshed and inevitable foreign intervention and interference. No one could deny that such intervention would take place. Emphasis added, the Ethiopian foreign minister did not clarify or circulate the possible source of foreign intervention. Mr. Aklala concluded his presentation at the fourth session by referring, once again, to Ethiopia's plea that justice be rendered to her people since they suffered immeasurably under fascist rule, and that Ethiopia should be allowed to incorporate Eritrea, as a reparation for half a century of wrongs and injustices done to the Ethiopian people. Sheikh Ibrahim Sultan, head of the independence bloc of Eritrea, was one of the 4 Eritrean political leaders invited to address the subcommittee on Eritrea. Sheikh Ibrahim challenged the Ethiopian foreign minister on almost every point he made on Eritrea. He rebutted Aklala's assertion that Eritrea lacked economic resources and the trained personnel to exist as an independent state. The head of the independent bloc reminded the Ethiopian foreign minister of various statements made by the M. Perer and Aklala himself to the effect that numerous Eritreans were holding high and responsible jobs in the Ethiopian civil service system. Sheikh Ibrahim reminded the Sutramidi that the Eritrean people requested that no colonial regime, European or Ethiopian, be imposed on them. After listening to the various interested points on Eritrea, the majority of the subcommittee bears argued that they did not have adequate information on which to base their recommendation for Eritrea. As a result, they accepted the Chilean delegates' proposal to dispatch a United Nations fact-finding mission to Eritrea, to gather informally and ascertain the wishes of the inhabitants. November 21, 1949, the General Assembly, by a vote of 48 yes, I know and 9 abstentions, voted for the resolution, officially known as 289A, 4, stated that a 5-member United Nations Commission would be sent to Eritrea to ascertain more fully the wishes and the best advance of the welfare of the inhabitants of Eritrea, to examine the question of the disposal of Eritrea and to report for the General Assembly, together with such a proposal or proposals as it may deem appropriate for the solution of the problem of Eritrea. UN Commission of Inquiry. A 5-man delegation from Pakistan, Guatemala, Burma, South Africa, and Norway visited Eritrea for a period of 7 weeks, from February 14 to April 6, 1950. The commission arrived in Asmara to commence its work in the midst of intense political ferment. British authorities in Eritrea were able to establish a direct link between the activities of Colonel Nega Haile Selassie and the terrorism of the Union Party. The colonel channeled funds and propaganda to Andane, the terrorist army of the Union Party. The campaign of intimidation, terror and sometimes Brit *re began to have the desired effect. The Ethiopian orchestrated political turmoil created serious doubts in the minds of the commission members as to whether Eritreans had the political maturity to name an independent state, a point the Ethiopian foreign minister made in the debate during the 4th session of the General Assembly. The governments of the US and UK received prior information that the Commission of Inquiry would not adopt the basis US/UK proposal the partition of Eritrea in any of its recommendations. Therefore, in anticipation of the Commission's recommendations, which might include in instance, unacceptable to Ethiopia, the State Department and the Foreign Office formed a committee to formulate a common US/UK position. The thrust of the US/UK plan was to wage a diplomatic campaign to other countries in General Assembly to XJRL the basic US/UK position, to make it passive for Italy and Ethiopia to work out an agreement XCE, cable to both regard case of the findings of the UN Commission of Inquiry. To secure an agreement with whomever squires Eritrea to safeguard the rights and privileges of the Italian settlers in the territory, and fluidly, the US and UK committed themselves to searching for a formula that would accept to the advocates of NTBCGCRL as assembly and that would permit Ethiopia to achieve a substantial of Eritrean objective. When the Commission of Iruri finally submit its Nsetekra the contents the recommendations contained in those recs say *ed, even in part, the core US/CK Hopisal, the partition of Eritrea. Instead, the Commission 3 UN trusteeship, then in, Pakistan and Guatemala, federation with Ethiopia, South Africa and Burma, and union with Ethiopia, Norway. Of the three recommendations put forward by the UN Commission, the United States government felt the one sponsored by South Africa and Burma for a federal union between Ethiopia and Eritrea seemed to offer the best solution at the time. In the opinion of the State Department, a federal arrangement was the type of proposal the advocates of in the General Assembly would find attractive. Because it offered autonomy, it would also find favor with Ethiopia, because Ethiopia would have an outlet to the sea. What was left, then, was to draft the proposal in such a way that it would receive acceptar in the General Assembly and, simultaneously, to make it attractive enough for Ethiopia that the Emirates would finally accept it. Of establishing a federal union between Ethiopia and Eritrea did not originate with the South African or Burn Resolutions of the UN Commission. Early in 1949, when the Independence BICX was at its zenith and the Unionists were disintegrating, Ethiopia, on her part, subtly initiated discussions toward creation of a federal arrangement with Eritrea, since from Ethiopia's point of view federation was much preferred to the dreaded Ethiopian ministers visited Asmara frequently to seek advice from the British officials in the Eritrean capital on how to combat the increasing strength of the according to Brigadier Drew, the of Eritrea, officials. Were coming increasingly non-semistic that Ethiopia might are able to acquire any part of Eritrea if the present trend continued. In a cable to F main office, Brigadier Drew wrote, the Ethiopians were prepared to discuss secretly with influential memtakers of the bloc a policy of conditional federation of the whole of Eritrea to Ethiopia, subject to the ending satisfactory from Ethiopian as the Ethiopians intimated to Drew that they would secretly with influential pro-Imjevkstans Eritreans. Emrever Haile Selassie invited members of the Moscow League of Misawa and the Lit Ral Unionists to with him in Addis Ababa for Lions. The Ethiopians and the Eritrean group agreed to a basic federal formula that granted Eritrea substantial local autonomy under nominal sovereignty of the Ato Siam the foreign Remern Tekra of the bloc who quit Tier bloc the year before and was of the Addis Ababa negotiators, made public the contents of the Federal proposal agreed to by his group and the Ethiopians. In his AP, Zaranstra for the Commission of Inquiry, Ato Siam stated that his group preps the General Assembly to consider and sponsor the federal arrangement as to guarantee its pro-FR implementation. The Federal alternative was the subject of bilateral discussion the governments of Ethiopia and Italy under the auspices of Tier US government. About the time Ethiopian officials were conferring with Ato Siam and his group, Foreign Minister Aklalu Haptwald approached U.S. officials with another federal plan he wanted the U.S. government to sell to the Italians. Aklalu's plan, Ethiopia would assume jurisdiction over foreign affairs, defense, police, communications, commerce, and finance. While Eritreans would assured basic rights and fundamental freedoms as well as adequate safeguards for the rights of Italian settlers in Eritrea. Under Aklalu's conception of federation, Eritrea would become a virtual province of Ethiopia. The two federation proposals submitted by the Ethiopians were markedly different from one another. Any or worried out with the Eritrean group in Addis Ababa gave Eritrea a substantial and grec of self-MK and legislative WRNY, it precluded the stationing of foreign TRLXPS on Eritrean soil, and also guaranteed Eritreans cultural however, the plan in the hands of the Americans left very little for Eritreans except a general statement that their human rights wauki respected. It was not clear at the time why the Ethiopians came with two substantially different forms of federation. Perhaps they felt that by conducting a deal with the Italians, Ethiopia would confront Eritreans with a fait-acre plea and Eritreans would have no alternative but to accept whatever Ethiopia and Italy agreed on. According to Aklalu, if only Ethiopia could get Italy's concur on a plan, then Eritreans would soon be forced to fall in line. Ethnic-tolerant officials had long felt that if it not even for Italian influence on Eritrean union between Ethiopia and Eritrea would have been carried out a long time ago. It is unlikely that Siam Mosh Zero and the other IT0 points of the federal plan were aware of Aklelu's backdoor approach to the Italians through the American government, with a plan offering much less than agreed to by the Eritreans. The Italians had indicated to the United States government Italy's readiness to accept a federal union between Ethiopia and Eritrea. *2 Under Italy's proposal, defense, foreign affairs, and international track would fall under the jurisdiction of the federal government, while matters of local government, including domestic trade, taxation, maintenance of law and order, would be in the hands of Eritreans. Included in the Italian plan was a provision for a customs union for the entire so as to form a viable economic unit. The Italians stressed that any federal arrangement should contain strong features to safeguard the rights of the Italian community in Eritrea, and the plan should be acceptable to all independence groups in Eritrea. Back at the United Nations at the time when the US was immersed in behind-the-scenes negotiations to win approval of the federal solution, the Interim Committee of the United Nations met to receive and debate the findings of the UN Commission of Inquiry for Eritrea. The committee, however, could not make recommendations because of an intense diplomatic campaign by the US that its own favored solution, federation, should be considered. The General Assembly, however, referred the issue of Eritrea to ad hoc committee for consideration and final recommendation. When the ad hoc committee began to consider the question of Eritrea, there were two main proposals and 5 resolutions before it: independence, sponsored by the Soviet bloc countries, Pakistan and Iraq, and federation, co-sponsored by 14 states, but mainly drafted by the US and the UK. The ad hoc committee heard from interested parties, including Eritrean political leaders. Sheikh Ibrahim Sultan, head of the independence bloc of Eritrea, reiterated his people's desire for independence. Since the passage of the federation proposal was a foregone conclusion, Ibrahim Sultan expressed the dismay of his people that the UN was preparing to impose a government structure on Eritrea without giving the people a chance to express their opinion on the matter. Sheikh Ibrahim called Federation an 33 which was incompatible ambiguous scheme with the aspirations of the Eritrean people. Sirui Federation can only exist between independent states of equal sovereign rights, and not trying one an independent state and one which is being denied independence. 34 The issues raised by Sheikh Ibrahim were later elaborated by some members of the ad hoc committee. Sheikh Abdul Jabbar of Saudi Arabia challenged the assertions by the pro-union and pro-federation groups that Eritrea's economic viability was doubtful. Sheikh Abdul Jabbar argued that any solution other than independence was unreasonable and discriminatory and unjustly penalized the people of Eritrea. If the criteria that were being imposed on Eritrea were to be applied to other countries of the world, perhaps all of them would not be able to retain their sovereignty today. 33 The Soviet delegate saw the federation proposal as the outcome or the struggle among the colonial powers for a new partition of the former Italian colonies. If federation is a suitable solution for Eritrea, argued the Soviet delegate, then the question should be decided by the people of Eritrea themselves, and not by some international organization. The USSR submitted a counter-proposal calling for Eritrean independence immediately, arguing that independence was the equitably solution. After disposing of the Soviet-sponsored proposal to grant Eritrea independence, the General Assembly, on December 2, 1950, voted to accept the ad hoc committee's recommendation to federate Eritrea with Ethiopia. Foreign Minister Aklalu Habtwald stood before the General Assembly and pledged that Ethiopia would do its utmost to respect and honor the terms of the federal agreement. On December 14, the General Assembly appointed Dr. Anti-Macienzo of Bolivia to draft a constitution for Eritrea, to convoke an Eritrean assembly and to ratify the federal act in the name of the Eritrean people. However, Dr. Macienzo's task was made much more complicated, because Article 12 of the Union Federal Resolution required him to consult with the Ethiopian government in preparing a constitution for Eritrea. Although Eritrea was mandated to have a democratic form of government, the UN resolution did not make it clear how the Ethiopian emperor was expected to give his assent to the establishment of democracy and fundamental freedoms in Eritrea without simultaneously providing the same privileges and rights to his own subjects in Ethiopia proper. Those who espoused federation as the best solution for Eritrea must have known that there was very little likelihood that the emperor would adhere to the terms of the federal arrangement without substantially liberalizing his own rule in Ethiopia, something he was not inclined to do. Therefore, since the emperor did not give any signs that the was moving toward democratizing his regime, the possibility that would permit Eritreans to enjoy the rights to them by the federal charter, setting up the new government of Eritrea as instructed by Article 12 of the 1950 UN resolution, Dr. Mashinzo held a series of formal and informal meetings with Foreign Minister Aklalu and his deputies in Asmara, Addis Ababa, and Geneva from May to July, 1951. However, right at the outset it became clear that the overriding objective of Aklalu was to weaken the democratic basis of the proposed Eritrean government, to dilute its autonomy, and eventually to facilitate the integration of Eritrea into Ethiopia. Dr. Mashinzo saw his responsibility in a much different light, to draft a constitution for Eritrea that would safeguard its autonomy and ensure that its government would be based on sound democratic principles. Mashinzo sought to translate the UN resolution by giving Eritrea a sound autonomy. Foreign Minister Aklalu strove to weaken and eventually kill that autonomy. The negotiations between Mashinzo and Aklalu were becoming long and contentious, since the Ethiopian foreign minister was determined to install his version of autonomy on Eritrea as opposed to the strong autonomy envisioned by Mashinzo. In the end, Aklalu began to pay off as Mashinzo's steadfast defense of the democratic foundation of the UN resolution began to wane. As a direct result of Aklalu's incessant effort to weaken the implementation of UN Resolution 390-A-V, Mashinzo agreed to incorporate into the Eritrean constitution elements that were not implied, directly or indirectly, in Federal Act. Not only did Mashinzo agree to recognize the Ethiopian as the federal government, he also consented to allow the Mfekir to have a representative in Eritrea with the power to promulgate legislation. On April 25, 1952, Mashinzo submitted a final draft of the Eritrean constitution to the Ethiopian government. Since orcs of the mandates of UN Resolution 390-A-V, was for Mashinzo to convoke an Eritrean assembly to consinr and approve the constitution, Mashinzo informed British authorities to prepare Tir Eritrean Muiatushan FCW the election of their representatives. 4 months before the final draft was in the hands of Ethiopians, the British authorities' Proclamation 121 setting the guidelines for indirect election in all parties of Eritrea outside Asmara and Massawa, where the authorities declined to hold direct elections. Proclamation 121 divided Eritrea into 238 administrative and electoral wards, out of which 68 constituencies were established, constituency representing 1 seat in the 68 Eritrean Assembly. Even though the districting of the electoral constituencies was based on geographical and political situations prevailing in Eritrea at the time, nevertheless, Proclamation 121 exhibited gross irregularities. It assigned more seats to Union Party strongholds in a proportion much higher than their share of the total at the XM1SE of those areas dominated by the Eritrean Democratic Front, an umbrella group of parties that consistently advocated a strong federal government for Eritrea. Though the stated aim of proclamation was to create a constituent assembly that was equally divided between Christians and Muslims to reflect approximate composition of the Eritrean population, the electoral wards were drawn in such a way that among the Muslims those were aligned with the Unionists, and thus who should easily controlled, were overrepresented. Though neither the British administering authorities the government of Ethiopia stated it openly, their objective was to create a weak and malleable constituent assembly. Of particular concern to the Ethiopians was the possibility that the IWW Assembly, in asserting its may reject aspects of the constitution, Foreign Minister Aklalu fought to instance single B, political party was expected to win enough seats in the assembly to amend, delete, or revise any article of the draft constitution, any of the major parties, the Unionists and the Democratic Front, would need to join forces with some of the smaller parties to command the 2/3 majority required for passage of any article in the draft. Of the 68 seats in the Assembly, the Unionists and their sympathizers won 34 seats. The Democratic Front and Independents controlled 19, and the remaining is went to the Muslim League of the Western Province, thus holding the balance in the Assembly. As expected, the Unionists and the Muslim League of the Western Province soon formed the winning coalition, effectively assuring the passage of the draft constitution without substantial revisions. In the end, the government of Ethiopia and the British administering authorities succeeded in engineering an election outcome that ensured only the passage of the draft constitution, but also the selection of Telde Barrow, Lexler of the Unionist Party, as the first chief executive of Eritrea, and Ali Rede, of the Muslim League of the Western Province, as president of the Eritrean Assembly. At the head of the newly born government of Eritrea were persons whose past history showed evidence of commitment to the notion of establishing a strong and effective self-rule in Eritrea as mandated by the 1950 UN resolution. Thus, when the Eritrean Assembly met for the first time on September 1952, it marked the beginning of the end of Ethiopian-Eritrean Federation. Phase 3, 1962 to 1975, when the Assembly passed UN Resolution 390 v. in 1950, creating the Ethiopian-Eritrean Federation, it gave Eritrea a constitution which explicitly stated that the provisions of the Federal Charter would not be amended or violated by anybody other than the General Assembly. 0 Yet almost immediately, Ethiopia began to take a series of steps whose cumulative effect was to dismantle key features of the federal arrangement without being subjected to any degree of disapproval from members of the United Nations. Ethiopia was able to accomplish its dream of annexing Eritrea because no single tri or bloc of countries were sufficiently interested in the integrity of the UN resolution that they were prepared to take Ethiopia to task for violating that resolution. Almost no government was willing to confront Ethiopia over Eritrea, directly or indirectly. Mainly Tico's other country was Eritrea as vitally important as it was for. Furthermore, Ethiopian diplomatic activity during the period successfully cemented critical alliances with the United States, Israel, and key African countries which, in turn, enabled Ethiopia to prevent the question of Eritrea from being discussed in any international forum. Though the United States government knew early of Ethiopia's encroachment of Eritrea's autonomy, it did very little to safeguard the integrity of a political solution for Eritrea, even though the US was responsible for drafting the resolution, getting it considered and approved by the General Assembly. Over the 10-year lyre of the ill-fated successive American consuls in Asmara to the State Department at Ethiopia's methical abrogation of the vital elements of the Federal Charter. As early as September 19, 1952, 4 days after the birth of the Federation on 15, Mr. Edward Mulcahy, the first American consul in Asmara, observed in a secret dispatch to the State Department that Ethiopians were trying hard to make the Federation much like annexation. Another American consul, Mr. Earl Ritchie, sent a candid assessment of the political situation in Eritrea in 1959, in which Eritrea is run as a police state insofar as political opposition is concerned. Devoid of any free or opposition PES, and with the police denied the political and other rights guaranteed to them by their constitution, Eritrea is today anything but the autonomous and democratic unit envisioned by the framers of the United Nations resolution. 2. Despite their vivid misgivings and the course of the FC and ration. Arnrican consuls in Asmara and her misjudged or misrepresented the extent of Ethiopian encroachment on Eritrea's autonomy. At Mulcha confided to Sheikh Ibrahim Sul. Tan that the entire process of forming the federation had gone smoothly, and the consul blithely added that the process had set an example that the rest of the African continent and the Mideast might emulate. Regardless of the assurances of the 18/Horn of Africa Volume 6, Number 2 American consuls that all was well with the Federation, Eritrean political leaders pressed the various consular representatives in Asmara to restrain Ethiopia from making a mockery of the 1950 UN resolution. Sheikh Ibrahim underscored the urgency of taking a quick action on the part of the United States to save the Federation before it was too late. In his conversation with American Consul Ritchie, Sheikh Ibrahim observed, "The US should not wait until the crocodile has swallowed his victim before taking any action. Since it would most difficult to the victim from the crocodile's belly once the crocodile had him there. The crocodile swallows his victim." In November 14, 1962, Asfaha Wolde Mikhail, Emperor Haile Selassie's hand-picked chief executive of Eritrea, went before the Eritrean assembly and read from a written statement in Amharic, a language understood by only a handful of the 68-member body. Asfaha informed the assembly, "The statement that I am going to read to you is the final issue of the Eritrean case, and there is nothing you can do other than accepting it as it is. We have rendered the Federation null and void. We are henceforth completely united with our motherland." 5. Even though the assembly was packed with known sympathizers of the Ethiopian cause, it was remarkable that the motion to dissolve the Federation was defeated 4 times the day before Asfaha's fateful announcement. Members of the assembly opposed to the demise of the Federation were bodily dragged to attend the November 15 session so as to give the appearance that the motion to dissolve Eritrea's special status was passed by a unanimous acclamation. The unification of Eritrea into Ethiopia was rammed through the assembly, regardless of what the members felt about it. The significance of Ethiopia's cynical and brazen violation of the terms of the 1950 United Nations resolution was not lost on the consular corps in Asmara, termed Ethiopia's move a brutal and arbitrary xt. Richard G. Johnson, the resident American consul in Asmara, wrote in a confidential memorandum to the State Department, "The unification was prepared and from above in maximum without the slightest public or discussion. The vote by acclamation a shoddy comedy, barely disguising the absence of Suvutli even on the pen of government-picked Eritreanism." Consul Johnson's assessment notwithstanding, the United States government said or did very little, in public or in private, to express its displeasure concerning the illegal demise of the Federal Union. Even though, according to Johnson's memorandum, Ethiopia's action betrayed considerable disrespect to the United Nations, an Ethiopian government had from the start enfeebled and the Eritrean government, the United States decided not to object to the destruction of the Federal Union, thus implicitly accepting Ethiopia's move on Eritrea. United States official response to Ethiopia's putsch was limited to withholding a congratulatory message to the emperor on the occasion of the union. Between Ethiopia and Eritrea indeed, the United States was uncomfortable about Ethiopia's flagrant disrespect to United States-sponsored 1950 United Nations resolution. Yet, U.S. officials were either unwilling or unable to take their private assessment of Ethiopia's action to the Ethiopian government, and in the end, out of political expediency, the United States to Ethiopia's takeover of Eritrea. The beginning of RHE armed struggle. The dissolution of the Ethiopian-Eritrean Federation in 1962 opened a new phase in the development of Eritrean nationalism. This was the period when Eritreans abandoned all that the UN would act to resurrect its 1950 resolution and request Ethiopia to abide by the 1950 decision of the General Assembly. Much to their dismay, Eritreans finally realized that all avenues for getting their case heard by the international community were blocked by Ethiopia and its powerful allies, at which time Eritrean nationalists decided to wage aimed struggle to drive the Ethiopian army of occupation off Eritrean soil. On December 4 SL, a few days after the federation was abolished, 2 large, one in Asmara and another in Misawa, took place simultaneously. Both demonstrations were attended by hundreds of students and workers, many of whom were carrying banners and Free Eritrea placards as well as the defunct federal flag, though Ethiopian soldiers and policemen responded swiftly and firmly, dispersing the crowd. The NLD demonstration caused unrest to spread to other towns in Eritrea. A week later, on December 11, another demonstration attended by hundreds of youth and similar in tone and purpose to Asmara and Misawa events occurred in Curtin. 5Z The demonstrations were the first signs of organized resistance to the Ethiopian action. Despite their response to the demonstrations, the Ethiopians did not fully understand of what had occurred. The Asmara, Misawa, and Karen demonstrations did not take place in a vacuum. Economic stagnation and political crackdown sent thousands of Eritreans to the neighboring countries of Sudan, Saudi Arabia, Somalia and Egypt. Included among the immigrants were well-known Eritrean political leaders such as Sheikh Ibrahim, Wolde Abwolde Mariam, former head of the Independence Party, and Idris Mohammed Adam, previously president of the Eritrean Assembly. These political leaders sent petitions to the United Nations and various foreign governments in regard to Ethiopia's violation of the 1950 UN resolution. In a memorandum to Dag Hammarskjöld, Secretary-General of the UN, the three Eritrean nationalists expressed their distress and frustration that the UN had completely ignored the fate of the federal union it mandated through its 1950 resolution. They warned Hammarskjöld that they could no longer restrain their people from resorting to violence to seek justice and freedom in the face of the unwillingness of the United Nations to stop Ethiopia from swallowing Eritrea. We regret that all our complaints, protests, and representations made in the name of the Eritrean people through Your Excellency to the UN have had no effect whatsoever. We fear that the people, exasperated by continuous disappointments, may eventually resort to force, which would certainly lead to disorder and anarchy, contrary to the basic principles of the United Nations. As soon as the three nationalists discovered that their petitions were going nowhere, they met in Cairo in July 1960, to form the Eritrean Liberation Front, ELF, whose objectives were to organize Eritrean refugees for political action, to initiate political organizing within Eritrea and finally to wage an armed struggle against Ethiopian occupation. Within Eritrea, and especially in the urban areas, political cells with membership of not more than 7 were established. It was these ELF organized cells that were responsible for organizing and orchestrating the December 4th and II demonstrations. Ethiopia used its position in the international community to deny a platform to Eritrean to press their grievance against dissolution of the federation. With all peaceful avenues blocked, the leadership of ELF decided to link up with Idris Hamid Aware, a former soldier with a long history of resistance against Italian and British rule. In September 1961, with a small contingent of fighting men, mostly Eritrean nationals formerly attached to the Sudanese army and police, and a contingent of superannuated Italian rifles, a new chapter in the history of armed struggle in Eritrea. By mid-1962, Awad, leading a ragtag army of around 500 under his command, was successfully harassing Ethiopian garrison troops around Agordad. However, resistance to Ethiopian rule was not limited to Awad's army or the Western Lowlands. On December 19, a small group of policemen deserted the Eritrean police force in Misawa, taking with them 21 rifles, 2 machine guns and rounds of ammunition. More significantly, the deserting policemen were accompanied by several prisoners arrested during the December 4th demonstrations in Misawa. The full ramifications of the armed uprising in the Western Lowlands was not lost on the Ethiopian government, even though it refused to acknowledge publicly the existence of opposition to the Etund Moor's rule. Nevertheless, Ethiopia responded to Awad's challenge by waging extensive military campaigns in the Western Lowlands, terrorizing civilians, burning villages of hard-towing ELF fighters. Ethiopia's military campaign, Yoaver, only succeeded in giving ELF visibility and credibility among Eritreans and previously committed to the struggle. Furthermore, Ethiopia's relentless and brutal forays into the Western Lowlands drove hundreds, and later thousands, of refugees into the Sudan. Among these refugees and displaced youth, ELF was able to without difficulty. Accounts of Ethiopian brutality and re-inherited cases of mass murder against civilian targets, mostly Muslims, TF sympathy and support to ELF from many Arab countries. The Ethiopians, therefore, through their Etians, unwittingly re-internationalized Eritrean issue. Through the mid-60s, the encounters between Ethiopian army and ELF were confined to the Western Lowlands. Because most of the external backers of ELF were Arab governments, the Eritrean issue was becoming intertwined with Mid-Eastern politics. From there in Damascus, Syria, ELF to ensure continued Arab support, found it to characterize the Ethiopian government as adroitly exploiting the situation to seek material and support from the United States and Israel. Enuxer Haile Selassie was active in diplomatically weaning some of the Arab African countries from their support of the Eritrean cause. At the 1964 Organization of African Unity, OAU, meeting in Cairo, the Emperor Mastermined the inclusion into the OAU Charter of a key clause sanctifying existing frontiers, which made the Arab African MCRNKRRS of the OAU wary in their SUG, WN of ELF. Furthermore, in 1967, Emperor Haile Selassie played a key role in settling the long-standing dispute between the government of Sudan and the Enyanya in the southern part of that country, for which the Sudanese government expressed its gratitude to Emperor by denying ELF ICCESS to Sudanese territory to zero freight against Ethiopian military in clearly, the combined diplomatic and military offenses against ELF appeared to weaken the capability of the resistance movement. The 1967 Arab-Israeli War further cut dramatically into the supply lines of ELF, since the Arab governments were now more preoccupied with the humiliating defeat they suffered at the hands of the Israelis. The Ethiopians reasoned that the Arabs now would not have the interest to champion ELF, and without Arab supply the Ethiopians expected ELF to wither away. By the end of the IWS, however, changes in tier Arab world created opportunities for ELF to regroup and to strike vulnerable Ethiopian targets. A coup in Libya by Muammar el-Qaddafi in 1969 made it possible for the new Libyan regime to be more sympathetic to the Eritrean cause and to supply arms and ammunition to Eritrean nationalists. Because of the victory of the National Liberation Front of Southern Yemen in 1969, Aden became an important staging area for smuggling arms and across the Red Sea into Eritrea. Also, Ghaffar Numiri, who assumed power via a coup in the Sudan in 1969, reversed the pro-Ethiopia policy of his predecessor and allowed ELF to operate once again from bases in the Sudan. Before the decade was out, the resistance movement carried out a series of dramatic actions inside Eritrea that forced the Ethiopian government to acknowledge the existence of a serious challenge to Ethiopia's rule in Eritrea. Emperor Haile Selassie succeeded in annexing Eritrea as a result of political and diplomatic support he solicited and received from foreign governments. He now tamed his attention to a similar strategy to assist him in putting down the in Eritrea. In 1970, the emperor journeyed to the Soviet Union and Egypt to drum up Sudan I in his battle against the Eritrean resistance movement. He attempted to persuade the leaders of the two countries he visited to intercede on his behalf with some of the Arab countries supporting the Eritrean cause. The emperor always felt that beta support for the Eritrean nationalists was externally based, a withdrawal of that support would seriously weaken the independence movement. Parallel to his diplomatic offensive, the Emperor undertook a military campaign in Eritrea, which was able to carry out due to the massive quantities of arms Ethiopia received from the United States government. Since May 1953, when the United States and the Ethiopian governments entered into a military assistance agreement, a result of which the Ethiopian Army and Air Force were entirely entrained along Arn-Rican lines. Between 1953–1970, the United States supplied Ethiopia with $200 million worth of arms and equipment for security needs, most of it coming after 1962. However, it was not Ethiopia's security net was in jeopardy, necessitating massive U.S. arms shipments to be funneled to Ethiopia. What was at stake was the threat to Ethiopia's rule in Eritrea, and the brewing political ferment that was beginning to engulf the emperor's government inside Ethiopia proper. Thus, the rationale of U.S. military aid to Ethiopia, ostensibly for its security needs, was in reality a cover to enable the emperor to reassert himself both in Eritrea and Ethiopia. The CS was committed to the status quo in Ethiopia for various reasons, including, a. the existence of communication facilities at Kagnu station in Asmara, b. the perception on the part of U_S. officials that Ethiopia was a stabilizing force on the continent, c. the proximity of Ethiopia to the Middle East and Indian Ocean, both of considerable importance to the VS, and d. U.S. access to Ethiopia's airfields. It was the official position of the US to stand by Ethiopia, because protracted instability in this second most populous country in Black Africa could have adverse repercussions which would ultimately harm US interests in the region. Emperor Haile Selassie and the Americans were in agreement that events in Eritrea, if left unattended, could create a degree of instability in the region which would not be in the best interest of Ethiopia and the US. Phase 4, 1975-present, by extending the geopolitical carrot, Ethiopia succeeded in drawing the CS and Israel into a united front with Ethiopia in her campaign to crush armed resistance in Eritrea. The Eritrean campaign was too costly for Haile Selassie and his allies, however. It cost him his throne, and it wasn't long before the US and Israel were unceremoniously kicked out of Ethiopia by military regime in Addis Ababa. The Eritrean independence struggle took a turn. The fledgling Eritrean People's Liberation Forces made their presence known as a result of a series of stunning victories against Ethiopian forces. The new liberation group soon demonstrated its superb organizing abilities in marshalling the resources and personnel required to carry out an effective guerrilla war. The inability of Haile Selassie to fight a war in Eritrea and simultaneously to deal with grave economic problems in Ethiopia led to the overthrow of the monarch by mid-level army officers. However, the change in regime in Addis Ababa did not improve Ethiopia's fortunes in Eritrea. The independence forces liberated huge chunks of Eritrea as well as scores of towns and post-Tushan centers. By late I-977 and early 1978, only Asmara, the two of Massawa and Asab, and 2 or 3 other towns were in Ethiopian hands. For tier regime newly installed in Addis Ababa, the situation in Eritrea was very bleak. Eritrea was on the verge of being liberated by the independence forces. The Russians who were in Somalia for many years training Somali soldiers saw an opening in Ethiopia when the new government asked the US, which was closely identified with the Haile Selassie regime, to leave Ethiopia. The military junta invited the Russians to Ethiopia partly because the Russians promised huge quantities of war material to be used in the campaign to recapture the Ogaden as well as Eritrea. Thus, the Eritrean question entered its fourth and most paradoxical phase. Right on the heels of the Russians, the Cubans left Somalia for Ethiopia. That both the Russians and Cubans were arrayed against the liberation forces in Eritrea was one of the paradoxes of the 1970s. It excited friends of Cuba to Cuban forces participating in a campaign to liquidate Eritrean cause. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, seemed to find it difficult to adopt a consistent Eritrean policy in as a member of the big powers that met to discuss the fate of Eritrea. The Soviet Union suggested that Eritrea return to Italy. In 1950 at the United Nations in New York, the Soviet delegate ran Eritrea, and since the late 19th, the Russians have spending huge amounts of resources to prevent Eritrea from becoming, whether it is cynicism or the Russians have historically on Eritrea that seems to enret their immediate geopolitical needs as opposite to any adamant progressive ideals. It is a distressing of Eritrean nationalism that the US and USSR would have take turns to Ethiopia's aid to fight resist Eritrean aspirations for enlitration. The nut face of the Cubans can rexually explained. 5t There is ample evidence that Cuban officers trained and led Ethiopian militia in campaign to recapture Eritrea. Cuba has veteranly and need any involvement in Eritrea. What is question, however, is Cuba's association and championing of Eritrean forces. At the Conference of Nations in Havana in March 1974, the Cuban legate asked during the meetings of Tier Committee that the question of Eritrean and NCEPLXED on Tier agenda. The motion failed because of Trevi lobbying by Ethiopia of committee. Even as late as 1978, Carlos Rafael Rodriguez, Cuba's foreign minister, on Syrian the justness of the Eritrean struggle for as well as Cuba's supply struggle. So why did the Cubans tum there on Eritrea? Especially when Cuban allies in Third World and elsewhere urged Cuba to involved in the campaign to recapture Eritrea. There are at least 2 possible explanations. Either the Cubans were adding as some gates of TKR Soviet Union against their own convictions, or they to the socialist anti-imperialist rhetoric of ruling junta. The young army officers overthrew Haile Selassie's govern *N T faced a severe crisis on the Eritrean question. In the battlefront, forces were in disarray, town after town was falling into TKR hands of the forces. The world was extensively on tis Eritrean isti, and for the first time since annexation of 1962 details of the illegal demise of the Fay and Ral situation were aroused. In short, the Eritrean issue was internationalized, and the RRW government found itself on the offensive. In irremediable RET and T-Cunant, Ethiopian Foreign Policy and TTV Eritrean Question, prepared by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1975. The military government prepared steps to isolate the Eritrean question from world public opinion. The DCXU 110 admitted that the dissolution of the Fay and Ral structure could not legally. Because United Nations was responsible for granting Fay and Ral Charter, any dispute involving Eritrea was an international issue yet. Tier D.Rart *NT conceded that to take the Eritrean issue to the United Nations would to the disadvantage of Ethiopia. CKX UNRWA then outlined Lysi Gui and Lervs in dealing with the foreign Lysi Ace Reeked of the Eritrean question. 1. To reiterate Ethiopia's fundamental position regarding the Eritrean issue that it is an internal affair of Ethiopia and should solved with the general context of Ethiopia as a whole. 2. To isolate Eritrea from world public opinion. 3. To ado different approxies to different countries when explaining tier Eritrean issue. For example, African countries would told that if Eritrea it will establish a dangerous precedent that may affect almost all nations in Africa. Arab countries would be reminded that if they continue submitting Eritreans, their actions may result in between Africans and Arabs. Ethiopia had a substantial intents with African countries. Other policies tailored for Western Europe, Asia, Latin America socialist countries were sold out. The Dergu went a long way toward implementing TGUI and lines biblisted in the 1975 Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ethiopian officials toured African, Warsaw PET, and Arab countries to explain the Ethiopian revolution in a tailored fit the INOLOGICAL predispositions of the countries they visited. The Warsaw countries were informed by their Ethiopian visitors that as long as the Eritrean were fighting the former regime of Haile Selassie, the Eritrean was a valid or. However, since the overthrow of discredited regime of the XW socialist government, there was every REA.QN to Eliav that Eritrean would CORND full quality participation in the new socialist Ethiopia, and Argunrant the Warsaw Pact countries acts #D. The Soviet Union endorsed the view of the Eritrean ISTI in its on Moscow radio on March 7, 1977, in which it said, countries in which national democratic systems have established can be considered non-progressive just they suffer from some case problems or, which is just a vestige of PST and is awaiting solu with the of the Soviet Union of the USV position on Eritrea. Other members of the Warsaw Pact countries followed suit. Their long held of the Eritrean was swept away to the new political reality emerging in the Horn of Africa. The Ethiopians also used similar lines of arguments with with Libya, South Sudan, and the Palestinian Litmashon organization, thus isolating Eritrean nationalists from their traditional bskers in the socialist world and at least wing of the Arab camp. In their tours of African capitals, Ethiopian officials remined African leaders of the sanctity of TKOAU Charter, which yield inviolable existing NYR and Rs and forbks interference in the internal affairs of a sister African country. By raising tier SFCTRE of Biafra and Katanga, Ethiopian diplomats convinced African governance that to extent that Eritreans were trying to cess and if they succeed in Tyre and Avair, then African country would emerge from by recasting the Eritrean issue as an internal matter of Ethiopia. The rulers of Ethiopia, like the MTA overthrew, were ABK to win the political sub-RT of most of the OAU countries. Even though there is public record that an official of the new Ethiopian government visited Israel, the TKRQ resumed the former UNFR's covered relations with the State of Israel. Despite Ethiopia's severance of diplomatic relations with the Jewish state in 1973, the Israelis offered the Dergu what they always offered Ernfer Haile Selassie's government, b. Political and Militancy as Volume 6, Number 2 Horn of Africa 123 Sistance to fight the WM in Eritrea. At least up to 1978, Israel supplied Ethiopia with arms and ammunition as well as training commando units and Tank Zero Eritors to remit the to put down TKR insurrection in Eritrea. Dergu and Haile Selassie impressed on the Israelis that if Tigray Eritreans ever they will join the Arab League and thus Israel of the southern portion of TTAE Red Sea and the Eritrean islands terrain. In its official Pralke Unsements, the Dergu has been a staunch sunrooter of Tigray Palestinians' rights to their Eri land, but the Sertir Ethiopians were directly Kalatun raiding with Israel. However, Ethiopia's influence on Israel for arms and ammunition was public by Moshe Dayan in 1978, the Dergu officially severed all relation contracts with Israel. Over the Ethiopia's foreign policy, as it applied to its objective in Eritrea, has changed very little. One cannot help but observe the ever-present striking the approaches and objectives of Mengistu Haile Mariam Haile Selassie, since on Eritrea at least, there is not the slightest difference between Socialist Ethiopia and Frile Ethiopia. The expansionist tendencies of Ethiopian rulers did not start with Mengistu. Historically, Ethiopian rulers, through amalgamation of facts and fiction, have attempted to expand horizon. Marjorie Parham, the historian, commenting on Haile Selassie's claim to Eritrea and Somalia in the Emily 40s, wrote, "It is in and ed sad that Ethiopia, recently herself the victim of inexrealism at its NWST ruthless, and faced with tasks at home and especially in the former misgoverned regions conquered by Menelik, should reviving his, Menelik's, I'm Frialist Plicy what Braham said of Haile Selassie 37 ago is equally TRTX of Mengistu Haile Mariam today. Just as Haile Selassie followed Menelik's expansionist policy, so is Mengistu following Haile Selassie's. The Eritrean question in international law. Barakit Habtsalasig. For over 30 years now Eritrean question has time and again pushed out of the consciousness of the international community, as represented by the United Nations. Two factors, at least, contributed to this self-induced collective amnesia. First, and more important, was the strategic and geopolitical design of the United States of America, and abetted by some of its Western allies. Second, was the expansionist ambition of Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, whose illegitimate claim on Eritrea was supported by the government of the United States, in return for the Emperor's agreement to grant the United States a base in Asmara and naval facilities in the Red Sea PON of Misawa. The history of Eritrea's disposal in modern times begins immediately after the end of World War I. But the four Allied powers, USA, USSR, UK, and France, could not agree on the future of the former Italian colonies. Under the peace treaty signed with Italy, the latter renounced her claims on the former colonies, Eritrea, Libya, and Somalia, which the four Allied powers were empowered to dispose of. In the event of disagreement among them the matter would be referred to the General of the United Nations. The four powers could not agree, and matter was referred to the General Assembly, which settled the future of Libya and Somalia in its third SES Zion, but referred the Eritrean case to the fourth session. The fourth session, November 1947, resolved to send a commission of El Khoury to visit Eritrea to discover the wishes of the Eritrean people. A five-man commission presented a divided report, with a minority of two, Pakistan and Guatemala, strongly advocating for Eritrea, while the majority, South Africa, Norway, and Burma, proposed different forms of association with Ethiopia. In 1950, the UN Assembly, then dominated by the United States, resolved to impose a federation between Eritrea and Ethiopia. This resolution rated to deny the Eritrean people their right to determine their political future, contrary to the provisions of the UN Charter. The overwhelming majority of the Eritrean FOPLE wanted complete independence. Documentary evidence recently and classified, under the U.S. Freedom of Information Act, attest to this fact. For instance, a telegram sent from the U.S. Embassy in Addis Ababa, dated August 19, 1949, states that 75% of the Eritrean people supported the independence Big Pally. This pillar will was set aside by the coincidence of U.S.-Ethiopian interests noted ADVC. This, too, is amply documented. There is, for example, a U.S. State Department memorandum dated March 10, 1949, on Emperor Haile Selassie's promise to grant the U.S. military facilities in Eritrea, after that area has been ceded to Ethiopia. The late Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, put the matter bluntly after Resolution 390 v. was passed when he said, "From the point of view of justice, the opinion of the Eritrean POP must receive consideration. Nevertheless, the strategic interests of the U.S. in the Red Sea Basin and world, make it necessary that the country be linked with our ally Ethiopia. 1. It is clear that at the very moment when the UN General Assembly had resolved to send a commission of inquiry to Eritrea, U.S. policy makers were busy charting out ways and means of gaining and maintaining control of the area. A letter written by U.S. Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal, to Secretary of State, then Atkinson, supports this conclusion. Forrestal wrote, "From the standpoint of strategic and logistical considerations, it would be up to the United States to have refineries, capable of supplying a substantial ration of our aviation needs, located close to a crude supply and close to areas where naval task forces would, fading and where airfields would LCXated, yet far enough removed to reasonably safe from with res FCT to the Middle East. Refineries Kate in Italian Somaliland and Eritrea would meet the foregoing conditions, therefore, as a long-range provision of bimensional military value, it is believed that concession rights should sought for United States interests to construct and operate refineries in Italian Somaliland and Eritrea. These rights should include and necessary transportation and port concessions to jetir with air and naval base rights and communication facilities. The letter BXS to give of things to come of the agreement TVT. Veen the US and Emperor Haile Selassie. Forrestal XGUES, it would appear that demands by our probable enemies for concessions of like nature would be invited if efforts were made by the United States to include the matter of concessions to us in prospective United Nations agreements for the disposition of former Italian colonies. This would, however, be satisfactory from the military if the matter could handled by agreement with friendly nations desiring control of Italian Somaliland and Eritrea. It is obvious who the nations were that secret M.Y. Forrestal had in mind. Less than 4 months later, Aklalu Habtwald, Taya then Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ethiopia, visited Secretary of State Dean Atkinson at Tier State Department, by his Enrican legal advisor, John, who was one of architects of Ethiopian foreign policy for many years. A recently released document shows the emerging pattern of a mutuality of interests between the American and Ethiopian. One passage of the document of interest to the discussion reads as follows: "The Secretary, Atkinson, expressed pleasure of the Enrican government at the military facilities which the Emperor indicated he would grant to the U.S. in Eritrea after that area has been ceded to Ethiopia. Mr. Aklalu responded that the Emperor was pleased to be of help in this matter. Still speaking in the name of the Emperor, Mr. Aklalu expressed satisfaction at the assignment of an Enrican military attaché to the mission in Addis Ababa and with the elevation of that mission to the rank of embassy. American policy was thus wedded to the idea of meeting Ethiopian demands, as a quid pro quo for strategic interests in Eritrea. State internal memoranda issued as guidelines for the U.S. and legation at the General Assembly were clear-cut on this issue. See a secret internal memo of September 27, 1948. In every instance, strategic and geopolitical factors, TLW welfare of aspirations of the Eritrean people, were the primary considerations. It was against this background of behind the then, that the UN Commission of Inquiry was on a mission which was pre-determined to a strategic objective. While the US was steering Resolution 390A, v. through the UN General Assembly, a debate with the USSR leading the against the proposed federation. The Soviet delegate charged. A decision is trying I'm based on the Eritrean people without its consent and hence, in violation of the fundamental principle of the right of self-determination of peoples. The United Nations must take a decision which will satisfy the longing of the Eritrean people for independence. The USSR negation objects to the proposal for the federation of Eritrea with another state without the participation of the peoples concerned, that is, without the participation of Eritrea. The Czechoslovakia delegate put it even more poignantly, contrary to the fundamental purposes of the Unilateral resolution, would deny the E*OPK of Eritrea the right to self-determination and impose on them a federation with Ethiopia which the great majority oppose. Instead of maintaining in that pan of world, the resolution would foster civil war and discord. Instead of assisting an oppressed and exploited people to achieve freedom and it would attempt to cover up the annexation a small state by a larger state. The Slovakia negation will aid to intrigues against the freedom of Fox. Emphasis added these were prophetic words. For, in point of fact, the federal WHEM was only a step leading to annexation, and the region has since that time. Federation, to annex Adan though it denied the Eritrean the exercise of their right to self-determination, Resolution 390A, v. did nonetheless contain TTR following via it implicitly recognized the national identity of the Eritrean and the territorial unity of Eritrea blursuant to Kalkneali Bu Enderies. It provided for an autonomous Eritrean government with clearly defined domestic jurisdiction in legislative, executive and judicial matters. It guaranteed the Eritrean exopfuchs respect and safeguards for their institutions, traditions, religions, and languages. It guaranteed all L**arsons in Eritrea the enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms, through a detailed provision of a Bill of Rights and Freedoms. It enshrined the democratic prerequisites in Article 16 of the Eritrean Constitution, derived from the resolution, which was the foundation of the above-listed rights and fundamental freedoms. Moreover, Article 16 was not to amend any circumstances. It was clear from the outset that this principle, and a democratic governance in Eritrea, was a thorn in the imperial flesh of Emperor Haile Selassie's semi-feudal government. The emperor's government to subvent the principles of the UN resolution embodied in the Eritrean Constitution and the Federal Act, which put the UN resolution into effect. In November, 1962, 10 years after they came into force, they abrogated the federation and incorporated Eritrea as a province. This event occurred a little over a year after the Eritrean Liberation Front stand the armed struggle and less than 6 months before the founding conference of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, in May, 1963. The emperor was expressly advised to do this. The timing was crucial for the success of his gamble. The aim was to present a fait accompli of an annexed Eritrea to the first enreading of an all-African heads of states which established the OAU in Addis Ababa. His gamble seemed to work. Not only was the Eritrean question not raised at the first OAU meeting, but a year later when the African leaders agreed to the colonially fixed boundaries to defend their statehood, Eritrea, a former colonial territory, was forgotten. This was due to Ethiopian ferocity and the Emperor's special status as an elder esteemed and father figure in a divided Africa. Thus was the Eritrean question off the African agenda for over a decade, with Haile Selassie's successors benefiting from his imperial signs and astute diplomacy, until the militancy of the EPLF forced the issues on international community. Eritrea and international law today. The fall of Emperor Haile Selassie's government in 1974 and the advent of a radical military government reversed the traditional pattern of alliances. By 1977 the Soviet Union switched sides from support of the Somalis to that of the Ethiopians in the contention for the Ogaden and the right of its people for self-determination. The Somali army lost out to Ethiopian army in a war in which Soviet weapons and military advice together with 15,000 Cuban troops fighting on the Ethiopian side changed an earlier Somali victory into defeat, by the spring of 1978. The Soviet-backed Ethiopian army, now considerably strengthened, turned its attention to Eritrea. Here again, the Soviet Union unabashedly changed sides, reversing its previous of the Eritrean cause as a just or. This inwardful external involvement revived the question of international law in Eritrean Quest FOT Articles IN 55 of the United Nations Charter and several resolutions of the UN General Assembly Provi, KT the legal Fran EW Org for the exercise of the right of Tulmdeed, the evolution of international law in the era of Arlonization, particularly since has dramatic. The ion of resolutions IS 14 and 1541 in 190 and 2526 in 1970 leave no room for doubt but that the international community, and its legal expression, the UN, hold for even entertaining any denial to the quest of opals under colonial rule or alien domination, for self-determination up to an FNCKNCE. It is unthinkable today even to contemplate the action of Resolution 390 v, under which the Eritrean people were denied their right to self-and termination. The fact remains, though, that not only were the Eritrean people's right denied in the first place, but the Ethiopian government's violation of terms of the resolution went unheeded, remain unsanctioned. Today the question now is, how long can the issue evand or postponed, without calling into question the integrity of the UN system as a whole? Certainly, in the face of the murderous war which has sent nearly 1 million refugees the border, and in view of the resistance of Eritrean Popular Resistance and the GROMH of the guerrilla army backed by the entire population, the UN can no longer continue to ignore the question. In terms of general principles of international law, the Eritrean demand, this time, arms in hand, that what was granted to the other foreign colonial reoples of Africa as a matter of right must be granted to them, too. Few have the justice of their cause, on moral or legal and justice. Like is indivisible. In more terms, the following questions arise with respect to the Eritrean claim to self-determination and independence. L. Is the population of Eritrea within the meaning of international law pertaining to self-and termination? 2. If the answer is in the affirmative, was that the right exercised in 1952 when UN Res. Resolution 390 v. came into effect? What was the effect of the Federation and the incorporation of Eritrea into Ethiopia in 1962? Does United Nations have the right now to inquire into the Eritrean claim for independence made by the liberation move? First question was aptly answered by the International Commission of Jurists like this: the Eritreans have as much right to considered as a FOPC as the FOPLE of most of the African countries which were created by the division of Africa among the infidel powers at the end of the 19th century. The ICJ goes on to point out that UN Resolution 390 v, which proposed that Eritrea be treated as an autonomous unit within the Ethiopian, was clearly treating the Eritrean population as a people distinct from the of Ethiopia, with a territory of their own defined by colonial history. This was also the conclusion reached by Permanent Tribunal of Peoples in May, 1980. As to the second question, the introductory discussion has that the Eritrean people did not the UN proposal, it was forced on them. No referendum or plebiscite was arranged to enable them freely to express their wish. Resolution 390 v. created a vicious circle. The Eritrean were in a take-it-or-leave-it situation UNNR which an assembly accepted a fates accompli. That assembly cannot regarded as representative of the Eritrean people or as having popular mandate to agree to the UN proposal. Addressing this issue, the ICJ expressed a mirror, as follow ws, it is clear that they, the Eritreans, can bring forward strong evidence to support these contentions. Nevertheless, it seems difficult to conceive that the United Nations of today would agree to override a case of the United Nations taken 30 years earlier on a matter of this. In answer to question 3, ICJ argues that even assuming that the Eritrean FOPLE were presumed to have accepted the UN proposal of El Ral autonomy within an Ethiopian federation, the people have the right to claim independence afresh, if the federal state concerned denies its democratic rights to the people who have opted to join it. The authority this conclusion is UN Resolution 2526 of 1970, which declared the principles of international law concerning friendly relations and CCN fashion among states. Resolution 2526 provides the clearest legal authority for the principles of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. It defines the relationship between this principle and the principle of the territorial integrity of states by making the latter conditional the observance of the former principle. It states, nothing in the foregoing paragraphs shall construed as authorizing or encouraging any action which would dismember or impair, totally or in part, the territorial integrity or political unity of sovereign and independent states conducting themselves in compliance with the principle equal rights and self-determination of peoples as described above, and thus possessed a government representing the whole people belonging to RHE territory without distinction to race, creed or color. Emphasis ed. It is clear from this crucial passage that where there is a violation of the principles of equal rights and self-determination, this right would prevail over that of territorial integrity. As noted earlier, the violation of the terms and conditions forth by the UN resolution had started almost immediately after the Federation came into force. The Emperor's representative infringed on the autonomous jurisdiction of the Eritrean government. Basic democratic and human rights, including freedoms of the press, of belief, and of association, were suppressed. Less than 5 years after the entry into force of the Federation, Tigrinya and Arabic, which were the official languages of Eritrea, were suppressed and arbitrarily substituted by Amharic. This created enormous obstacles to the educational advance of a whole generation of Eritreans. Then the cause to read to the Eritrean Assembly a proclamation announcing the termination of the Federation. The assent, which the Eritrean Assembly submissively gave to proclamation, was obtained literally at gunpoint with armed members of the paramilitary police present in the assembly hall, with others demonstrating outside, brandishing their arms menacingly. But even if the assent had not been obtained on Equidurus, it would still be illegal. Members of an Eritrean assembly sworn to defend the Eritrean constitution and the rights of the citizens, no mandate to assent to the overthrow of the system without a referendum or other forms of popular participation. Indeed, the Eritrean constitution provides that the assembly may not, by means of an amendment, introduce into the constitution any provision which would not in conformity with the Federal Act, and Article 16 of the constitution, by the terms of which the constitution of Eritrea is based on the principles of democratic government, shall not amended. It is clear from that the abolition of the Federation and the incorporation of Eritrea as an Ethiopian province was not in compliance with the principle equal rights and self-determination. As the ICJ Bas put g, since the people of Eritrea ex hypothesis, agreed to union with Ethiopia only as an autonomous unit, the abolition of that status and its integration within Ethiopia cannot be regarded as being in compliance with equal rights and nation of peoples unless there was a clear and unequivocal decision by the peoples of Eritrea in favor of that change. As to the question whether the UN is entitled to inquire into the claim of the Eritrean RX Opal for the above discussion in answer to the third question has indicated the answer. International law has affirmed the centrality of the principle of equal rights and self-determination of Eritreans. Not only the General Assembly of the UN but authoritative juristic opinion has reaffirmed this principle. The International Court of Justice gave an opinion, at the request of the General Assembly, in Resol VCT of the Right of the People 30/Horn of Africa Volume 6. Number 2 of Western Sahara to self-determination. Clued. Inter alia, that the juridical ties which might have existed at THC onward of Slunish colonization between the 9 OPK of Western Sahara, on the one hand, and the Kingdom of Morocco and Mauritania, on the other, could RWW exercise of the right of the Sarab to the Permanent PKS Tribunal, which gave an advisory opinion in the case of Eritrea in May 1980, makes specific reference to the opinion of International Court on the Western Sahara. drawing a parallel between the Sarai and Eritrean and affirming the existence of an Eritrean in international law International Court of Justice, which is traditionally courteous and conservative. Emphatically the central role of the Pruripkov in contemporary international community. The S tribunal is even more categorical in as the centrality of this Priksipk. And, as Friedman has written, in the development of general pleas of law, more important judicial will continue to from SF jail international tribunals, or from arbitration tribunal is clearly emit the of Eritrea now more than ever its responsibility did not end with the passage of Resolution 390 its coming into force in 1952, as Antti Malinro, the UN Commissioner on Eritrea, and his of jurists put it, with regard to the application of the Assembly's resolution after the entry into force of Act and Tier Eritrean Constitution have core into force the mission entrusted to the General Assembly under the Pexi Treaty with Italy will have been fulfilled and that future of Eritrea must be regarded as scaled, but it not follow that the United Nations would no longer have any right to with case lion. The United Nations resolution of Eritrea remain an international instrument RY. If violated, Tier General could seized of matter. See the UN is thus not only entitled but is duty-bound to entertain a * airing of the Eritrean case. The Ethiopian government can avail itself of Article 1(7) of the Chanur, which BC read together with Resolution 390 s, and other UN resolutions, and Mably Resolution 2526. As explained Jave. Inct, the Ethiopian government, teasing aware of tier legal validity of the Eritrean claim for and issued a secret memorandum to its diplomats to steer clear from any involvement in legal arguments over the issue. But rather to stress politico-strategic Irnelra arrives. I is a growing awareness about the nature and justice of Eritrean cause and prestigious juridical circles, including the International Commission of Jurists, have advocated the weight of their authority to that cause. It is to be hoped that the growing number of states that now support the Eritrean claim in Africa, the Middle East and elsewhere will succeed in bringing the matter for the UN General Assembly and thus help pave way for a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Document. Discussion on the drafting of RHE Constitution report of the consultation session between the UN Commissioner for Eritrea, Mr. Antti Mashinzo, and the Ethiopian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Aklilu Abdwolda in Addis Ababa on May 28 to 29, 1951. This document, as far as we know, is being made available for English readers for the first time, and Menk of Harvard University translated it from the French. UN reference numbers, 1,780,887.0319 inches to 0331, originally, it was intended to be a part of the UN Progress Report to record as far possible the constitutional wishes and aspirations of the Eritrean people. Theoretically, the drafters of the constitution should have eluded representatives from Eritrea, the UN, and Ethiopia. In reality, however, the Eritrean representative was conspicuously missing. Of the three major participants of the session, two represented the Ethiopian government, Mr. Aklilu Abdwolda, the foreign minister, and Mr. John Spencer, an American, who was, for more than 3 decades a confident and respected foreign affairs advisor to the Ethiopian monarch. Mr. Spencer, a fluent speaker of Amharic, the Ethiopian official language, left Ethiopia after the fall of Ernfekher Haile Selassie in 1974. Mr. Abdwolda, educated in France, served in various positions including cabinet level until he was imprisoned and executed by the DCRG in 1974. Little is known about Mr. Antti Mashinzo, the UN diplomat from Colombia. He directed the drafting of the Eritrean constitution. It shows that the Eritrean people were not directly represented and therefore didn't contribute to its drafting. Jordan Gabra Aklilu Abte Wold, Minister of Foreign Affairs, welcomed the United Nations Commissioner to Eritrea and stated that he would be happy to hear the Commissioner's views on the principal task which he had been assigned by the General Assembly, that is, on the constitution he is to draft. United Nations Commissioner to Eritrea, indicated that he was happy to work in the excellent spirit in which his task is unfolding. He arrived in Eritrea 3 months ago and the ambience which surrounds him there is completely positive. The Commissioner envisions his task clearly and simply. The solution of the Federation was decided upon after a serious study and an on-the-spot investigation, during which the different views of persons representing diverse sectors or Eritrea were gathered. The solution brought to the Eritrean problem is a political one of compromise. It is not a case of consulting the population about the federation which the General Assembly resolution established, but their support should now be sought for the initiation of the execution of this resolution. The Eritrean public opinion will be expressed later, at the moment when the Eritrean Assembly must, by vote, approve the constitution. If this approval cannot be obtained at that time, such a rejection would be the means by which the Eritrean public opinion shows that it does not accept the resolution of December 2, 1950. The trips of the Commissioner to Eritrea have had as their goal to familiarize him with the country, to enter into contact with public opinion, to observe the reactions of public opinion and to explain the General Assembly's resolution. These trips have brought him a very positive component. All sectors of the country accept the resolution of December 2 in that it constitutes their country as an autonomous unity, and practically ATLTHC different groups offer it their help and support. Drafting a constitution is not only an academic task, it is also a political one which is very important in the history of Eritrea. Before the dissolution of December 2, 1950, was voted on by the General Assembly, there were already, so it appears, bandit activities in Eritrea. Since his arrival, the Commissioner unfortunately has not noticed any improvement in the situation. Solution will be accorded to Eritrean citizens and to all persons residing in Eritrea. The provisions of number 7 could be integrated into the text of the Constitution. Even though the human rights and fundamental liberties of all people residing in Eritrea are recognized, these people fall into 3 different categories: I. Those possessing the federal nationality; 2. Those possessing a foreign nationality and have lived in Eritrea for 10 years before the date of the adoption of the December 2, 1950 resolution. These people will be authorized to live in Eritrea and to consecrate themselves there to any peaceful law-abiding occupation. 3. Other foreigners. It would be useful to introduce into the actual text of the Constitution an article which reproduces the essential parts of the last paragraph of the preamble of the resolution concerning the respect and safeguarding of the institutions, traditions, religions, and languages of the inhabitants of Eritrea. The official and the recognized languages of Eritrea should be determined. One or several of the native languages should have the status of official languages, perhaps Tigrinya or Arabic. It also seems that a European language should have the status of official language, English, which has a great international diffusion, or Italian, which is understood and spoken by a large part of the native population. Questions included in the jurisdiction of the government of Eritrea and those included in the jurisdiction of the federal government must be determined. Number 3 of the resolution indicates the areas which come under the jurisdiction of the federal government. The other areas fall under that of the Eritrean government. Among the questions included in the jurisdiction of the federal government are found national defense and the police, foreign affairs, money, finance, exterior commerce, communications, post office, telegraph and telephone systems on one hand, roads and railroads on the other under federal jurisdiction when they are used for communications with foreign countries, or at the same time for local and foreign use, aviation and ponds. Under the exclusive jurisdiction of the Eritrean government fall legislation and justice. Public AF General Assembly resolution does not give him the mandate to concern himself with this problem. He must work in close collaboration with TFR British administration and the Ethiopian government and rigorously respect their respective jurisdictions. The problem of bandit activities falls under the British jurisdiction. The Commissioner does not wish to encroach upon this jurisdiction, but he has publicly condemned, in accordance with the principles of the United Nations, the activities of the Shifta. He has also offered the British administration the moral support of the United Nations in Thai fight against bandit activities in Eritrea. These two alliance the unanimous favorable reaction to the General Assembly resolution on the hand, and the continuation of dangerous activities on the other constituted a great moral preoccupation which has pushed the Commissioner to decide that before undertaking consultations, there should be an attempt to establish race and tranquility. In fact, certain preparatory stages for the Ad 01 Meon of the Constitution, for example, the election of the Assembly cannot be accomplished except in an atmosphere of calm and confidence. The Commissioner exposed next the general ideas of the United Nations on the project of the Constitution. This would have four parts: I. A general part; 2. The Eritrean government iato; 3. The judicial; 4. The revision of the Constitution. The Commissioner will not now deal with the Federal Act which concerns the federal government as well as Eritrea. This act indeed will be easily drafted, since all its elements can already be found in the resolution. The first part or general pen will deal with the following points. The attribution of federal nationality to persons residing in Eritrea should be clarified. There will a single nationality, the federal nationality, which is that of the nationality of the Ethiopian Federation. Foreigners who have lived in Eritrea for 10 years will have the right to obtain the federal nationality. With regard to human rights and fundamental liberties, which, in virtue of number 7 of the Reso Fairs, prisons and Kakal administrations, production, agriculture, industry, interior, and the govern *nt of professions, work legislation, child security, public assistance, education, and public health. Apart from these, there are mixed jurisdictions, held by the federal government and the Eritrean government, such as finances, the Eritrean budget collection of taxes to cover expenses for special to Eritrea, and communications, roads and railroads of local and regional interest. Emblem of Eritrea could be Taipei and RAL flag of both Ethiopia and Eritrea. The Ethiopian national anthem with the federal anthem, there would be no Eritrean anthem. The second part, the organization of the government, would deal with the following points. The essential elements of a constitution are respect for human rights and fundamental liberties and universal suffrage and sincere elections. The Eritrean government should be simple. It should also effective authority would concentrated in a small number of people. The following problems present themselves for the electorate: universal suffrage or restricted suffrage, the establishment of the voting age for Muslims, the legal age when is conceded heir to an adult, is fixed at 15 years old. For Copts, there is, strictly speaking, no legal age. All of these questions must be studied later. The right to vote will given to inhabitants of Eritrea who have been granted federal nation. Aliti, 2. Piopk of Ethiopian origin living in Eritrea, the only condition that will be imposed on them will be that of a delay of residency. Taking a census of voters will difficult due to the lack of a census and of established traditions. With regards to the Assembly, the legislative power is generally of 2 chambers. It still seems that a single chamber should envisioned, which is conceived on democratic principles and is elective. There is no advantage either from or technical point of view of having an assembly composed of a large number of volume 6, number 2 Horn of Africa/33. The principle of eligibility must be established. An exception could be made for certain civil vants because one could fear that they would use their authority to exert a certain pressure on the voters. The principle of the incompatibility of the public function and the **** mandate must therefore be retained. The mandate of the deputies be very any method of the election of the assembly will depend in large part on the manner in which the question of the utilization of traditional means for the choice of the representatives of the population or of the combination of traditional means with democratic methods is resolved. The fact, for example, that certain elements of the population are semi-nomads will create a complication. As these people always have permanent points of attachment, they could be connected to a territorial district which is with electing the Commissioner Div 101 Vdia 1 Misohal idea according to which an election method based on the indirect method could be adopted. Maybe unities of 1,000 voters which would choose a delegate could be created. These end legates of electoral unities could in turn form a TXDY of voters who would elect a representative to the assembly. Other than its ordinary sessions, the assembly could hold line missing from toto copy of document. The commissioner is in favor of a fixed salary for members of the assembly. Parliamentary immunity should be inscribed in the constitution. It would useful to establish in Eritrea, alongside government and the assembly, a council of technicians who would ask to draft and revise texts of legal projects and regulations. This council would purely optional, its members would have to jurists. With respect to the executive, it seems that must be stable. He niest remain in charge throughout the duration of his mandate. The executive council would composed of several elements, the chief of the executive branch and the secretaries, charged with the direction of the different departments, which could coordesmnd to the diverse administrative activities. Terminology of these titles should established later. As for the administration, it seems normal that the Constitution fix certain rules concerning its institutions. These categories of people who could have access to public functions are found. Access would be open to Eritrean citizens as well as to those in possession of the federal nationality who are not Eritrean citizens. The third category of people could include foreigners. Since there are relatively few native Eritrean citizens capable at this point of occupying posts in the levels of the administration, access to the administration could be to foreigners. Foreigners could be brought to Eritrea for this purpose, but it would seem more logical to employ those who are already there and who are already in possession of some experience, that is to say the Italians and the British subjects. The Commissioner believes that the general idea which he has just set forth allow for a first discussion. He has avoided certain aspects of the question which he prefers to set forth in detail later. He added that his trips to Eritrea have not constituted consultations properly but have had as their object to make contact with the population. The British Chief Administrator has also expressed the desire to know the major lines according to which the Constitution would be established, in order to permit him to go ahead and undertake the formation of the administration. He would like, after this first reunion, to hear the point of view of the Ethiopian government, and thinks that after that it should be possible to establish the agenda of the consultations which will take place at Asmara upon the visit of the Minister of Foreign Affairs. After this visit, if the need is felt, work groups will be formed which will stay in touch with the Ethiopian government and which will proceed with detailed studies of diverse questions. Aklilu Abte Wold, Minister of Foreign Affairs, thanked the Commissioner for his very clear and succinct exposé and stated that he would communicate the point of view of his government during the course of the next reunion. He will then make several observations and will express some ideas on diverse points. It was decided that the next reunion would be held Tuesday, May 29, at p.m. The session ended at 5:30 p.m. Aklilu Abte Wold, Minister of Foreign Affairs, indicated that he would expose the point of view of his government, first in its principal lines and then entering into the major details, all the while following the order adopted by the Commissioner in his exposition of the day before. In the first place, he wished however to say a few words on the subject of the security problem in Eritrea. The activities of the Shifta do not constitute a new question. They were the subject of discussions at Lake Success before the arrival of Commission of Inquiry in Eritrea, on the occasion of its visit to Eritrea and afterwards at Addis Ababa. All the members of the Commission agreed to acknowledge that Ethiopia was in no way responsible for this situation, especially since the administration in Eritrea is a British administration. When the question was again debated in the course of this last session, the Minister of Foreign Affairs evoked the diverse interventions of His Majesty the Emperor and his very own in view of putting an end to these dangerous activities. In fact, the history of Ethiopia does not contain acts of terrorism committed for political ends. At the debates at Lake Success, the representatives of the United Kingdom himself recognized that the acts of bandit activities which were taking place in Eritrea were not political, and the Commissioner himself agrees on this point. The General Assembly resolution was favorably received in general by the population, Happy to see a long period of waiting come to an end. The Ethiopian government has always been ready to do all in its power to help stop bandit activities in Eritrea and will continue to do what it can towards this end. It is in fact in the interest of Ethiopia that peace and security should reign in a country that will become part of the Federation. Referring next to Articles II and 14 of the Resolution of December 2, 1950, relative to the arrangements to be taken by the British administration in view of the transfer of powers, the Minister of Foreign Affairs called to mind how much he had insisted at Lake Success that the solution brought to the problem of Eritrea be accomplished in a very brief amount of time in order to avoid problems of access and security. The Eritrean population has waited 9 years for its future to be decided. It should not have to wait any longer. But, in spite of this fact, the transition XRE0D has been fixed at 2. Moreover, the Ethiopian government, which is responsible from the international point of view the maintenance of order, the respect of the rights of foreign ers, human rights and fundamental liberties, and which however DCVS have the means to assure respect by the police of these rights, is justified in teasing concerned with the shifter problems. The Minister of Foreign Affairs declared himself in agreement from the general point of view with the observations of the Commissioner relative to the consultations with the population. Current consultations with respect to the Constitution and ulterior consultations on the representative and democratic system of government. With to human rights and fundamental liberties, which, in virtue of number 7 of the resolution, will be granted to Eritrean citizens and all citizens residing in Eritrea, the provisions of number 7 could integrated into the text of the Constitution. The Commissioner had stated that purpose of his trips to Eritrea had been to familiarize himself with the country, to enter into contact with public opinion, and to explain the resolution, but not to obtain the advice of the population on the federal solution. This solution had been decided upon by the General Assembly, after 2 commissions of inquiry had on location to explore the opinion and after representatives from different Eritrean parties had been heard at Lake Success. Such a solution established in this manner is certainly accepted by the majority of the population. It is a compromise solution and it is no longer necessary to ask the opinion of the population. In adopting the Constitution, the Eritrean people will express its acceptance of the resolution. Otherwise, it should not be forgotten that it is the Commissioner himself who is preparing the Constitution in consultation with Eritrean government of Ethiopia and others, that the Eritrean Assembly only adopts it and that even this adoption is not definitive because it does not go into effect until it is ratified by His Majesty. It also should not be forgotten that the desires of the inhabitants of Eritrea are not the only factor to take into consideration. In the resolution of December 2, 1950, in the resolution which created the Commission of Inquiry as well as in the peace treaty, the case and security of this part of the world and the rights of Ethiopia are also considered. All of these considerations assume some importance when the preamble to the Constitution is being drafted. The ideas of the Minister on this point will be presented at the opportune moment. As far as the other aspect of the consultations is concerned, namely the consultations implied by any democratic and representative system of government it is established. As would be the case with Eritrea, the Minister of Foreign Affairs agrees with His Excellency the Commissioner when he declares that this would be the first time in its history that Eritrea would enjoy such a system of government. Consequently, the introduction of this system into a country with no representative tradition and where there have never been elections and where no census takes place, results in certain complications and difficulties, as, for example, the difficulty of establishing, in the absence of any census, genuine electoral bases, the question of the voting age, the introduction of the procedures and techniques of election, the problem already raised of indirect elections, etc. Because of this lack of traditions and of men qualified to till governmental functions, His Excellency the Commissioner was logical and rational in proposing a single legislative chamber, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs is in absolute agreement with him on this point. This would in effect avoid electoral complications, procedure and other, and would not require the search for enough people capable of filling the seats in 2 chambers. For this same reason, all precautions must be taken so that the government is not at the mercy of a chamber without traditions, which could be the case for example if there were parliamentary system of the chamber must be simple and effective. Otherwise it should be noted that Article 2 of the resolution mentions three distinct powers. That is, legislative, executive, and judicial, of the Eritrean government. Ethiopia is however responsible for Eritrea on the international level. And yet Ethiopia 36/Horn of Africa Volume 6, Number 2 cannot assure order there because it cannot control the police there. Ethiopia can hardly accept nevertheless that a state of anarchy reign in a pen of the federal state such as the situation currently created by the Shifta. Consequently, the executive branch must armed with the powers necessary to assure order, security, protection if foreigners, etc. It is by means of the executive branch that the respect of federal jurisdictions will be assured. In addition, Article I of the resolution states that Eritrea would be a unity federated with Ethiopia under the crown of His Majesty the Emperor. Now it is evident that it is by means of the executive branch that the link with the supreme executive of the federation must be established. The Minister of Foreign Affairs went next to the study of the major details of the clauses of the Constitution. The General Assembly was in agreement on the principle of unity established by Article I of the resolution. The Commissioner's idea, according to which elections by districts can be envisioned, is in accordance with this idea of unity, and the indirect elections on the basis of districts is an extremely interesting idea and certainly one to studied. The powers of the legislative branch should be carefully considered. A detailed study should be consecrated as well to the powers of the executive branch in light of the Federal Act and the observations the Minister just made. Aklilu Abte Wold formally acknowledged the exposition which the Commissioner had given of the respective jurisdictions of the federal government, the Eritrean government, and the shared jurisdictions of the two governments. He formally acknowledged the Commissioner's observations on this subject, citing as examples of matters of federal jurisdiction, finances, money, the ports, the telephone, telegraph, and postal sys turns, interstate communications and commerce, interstate roads, foreign affairs, defense, aviation, etc., and the stated that when a matter is one of double jurisdiction, federal and local, it falls under federate jurisdiction, falling under the exclusive jurisdiction of the Eritrean government are notably health and education. It should be noted that health falls, in the case of international conventions, for example, under the jurisdiction of the federal government, since it will represent Eritrea on the international level. As far as education is concerned, the electoral government will also have jurisdiction when it subsidizes Eritrean schools or if it sends Eritreans abroad study. He does not feel it necessary to acknowledge in the Constitution the functions which the autonomous Constitution would obviously not be able to add tribute to the federal government, but those which are a direct result of the Federal Act are under the exclusive jurisdiction of the federal government. Example, in Article 7 of the resolution, the problem of the expulsion of foreigners, paragraph I, and the matter of the petition and the commutation of the death penalty, paragraph 0, fall under federal jurisdiction in virtue not of the Constitution but of the Federal Act itself. As far as Article 6 is concerned, it seems logical that those of mixed race cannot become nationals of the Federation Bill or the Federal Act goes into effect. This language is analogous to that used in many treaties. Now in these treaties no change of nationality is effected before the provisions which prescribe or permit this change go into effect. In fact, the Federal Act itself is not effective as long as it has not been ratified. As for certain questions which fall under the jurisdiction of the federal government, as the hiring of foreign technicians due to Eritrea's lack of qualified personnel, it does not seem necessary to include them in the Constitution. They can be the object of laws or of particular arrangements. The Minister of Foreign Affairs stated that the question of languages had been discussed with the Eritrean representatives, notably representatives of the Muslim League of Massawa and of THC Liberal Progressive Party who had come to see him. It is known that language in general is a factor of unity. In Eritrea several languages are spoken. The minister proposed that Amharic, which is the official language of Ethiopia, where several languages are also spoken, be adopted as the official language for Eritrea. Eritreans will nevertheless have THC right to address themselves to the administration in any other language which might be their OOD, and that the language of the region could be taught in the schools at the same time as Amharic. The Eritrean representatives who had come to see the minister accepted this proposition. The commissioner had suggested including in the constitution an article based on the last paragraph of the preamble relative to the respect and safeguard of the institutions, traditions, religion, and languages of the inhabitants of Eritrea, and the constitution, institutions, traditions, status and international identity of the Ethiopian Empire. This paragraph, on the one hand, refers not only to Eritrea, but also to Ethiopia. On the other hand, it appears in the preamble to the resolution, while the Federal Act, according to the provisions of Article 8 of the resolution, consists only of Articles I to 7. Consequently, it is doubtful whether it is to include such a clause in the Constitution. He believes, like the Commissioner, that the budget for Eritrea should be prepared by the Eritrean executive. The Commissioner had also indicated that the constitutionality of the Eritrean laws could be determined by an Eritrean court. This seemed the Minister to be an interesting idea. The Minister of Foreign Affairs finished by saying that, at the next session, or when the Commissioner felt it was an appropriate time, he would be happy to study in their major details the powers of the executive and legislative branches. Effectively, the Commissioner thanked the Minister of Foreign Affairs for having presented so clearly the point of view of his government on certain points of the Constitution. The Commissioner saw his present task in the following manner: there are three types of preliminary consultations, necessary, for the preparation of the definitive text of the Constitution. These are the consultations with the Ethiopian government, with the British government, and with the inhabitants of Eritrea. In order for this constitution to then go into effect, it must be approved by the Commissioner and by the Eritrean Assembly and ratified by the Emperor. The Commissioner would like to establish at this stage of the consultations his conception of the different elements contained in the resolution. This text EDT$ fixed elements which must be incorporated in the Constitution and which cannot change, as well as elements lending themselves to interpretation and which can be adapted to real situations. As a judicial norm, the Constitution is also element, and a living element destined to case and prosperity. Eritrea, which was first a colony, then was governed by foreign administration, will in unity as part of the federation. It is therefore in the interest of the federation itself that this autonomous unity be viable. The Commissioner finished by expressing his hope that outcome of this problem would be seen as one of the happiest proceedings in the history of the world. He remembered, the Minister, that he did not want to infringe on the jurisdictions of others. As far as the project of a constitution is concerned, the Commissioner must establish it in consultation with the authority designated by the administration, with the Ethiopian government and with inhabitants of Eritrea, but as far as the customs union and the formation of the assembly is concerned, it is not his responsibility but that of the British administration to take the initiative to consult the Ethiopian government and to ask the opinion of the Commissioner. The Commissioner would like to have a general view of the question. He was of the impression that certain groups of Eritreans were anxious to go ahead and he would like to know the progress already accomplished in this direction. Akllouabte Wold, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Rel stated that the Ethiopian government was offering to see necessite for its greatest collaboration and that it would demonstrate a great comprehension within the scopes of resolution, while taking the realities into account. Independent Eritrea, economically viable? Ariatsege, while the former Italian colonies of Libya and Somalia may now in and FNKNT of the United Nations, Eritrea, a former Italian colony, finds itself in an unending struggle to have the same rights and status for its people as did all other former European colonies of the Third World. Since many of them are much smaller in size, in economic resources and less strategically looked at than Eritrea, it is NTNV to verify or rectify the assertion that Eritrea is almost certainly not a viable unit on its own, that its FOPLK have chance for survival if it were to attain its, grey alvi of this paper is not to arcs for the independence of Eritrea on grounds of its economic viability. The question of is a Christian of the right of the Eritrean to self-determination as a colonized people, they rich or poor. But the allegation of an non-viable Eritrea, which has persisted since the Second World War, needs to the test. Main of this pot, XR is, therefore, to investigate or not an endevx NCKNT Eritrean nation would be economically viable. What makes this issue significant is that the alleged economic unviability of Eritrea was used at the UN in 1950 as of the reasons to deny the Eritrean VROP's right to an independence. Is Eritrea economically viable? How does its economy fare relative to those of other countries of the Third World? What are its economic miles and pros FCTS for future agricultural potential? It has alleged that the Eritrean economy's weakness is its limited agricultural potential as reflected by the yearly imports of stuffs during the colonial era, its low rainfall, and its primitive agricultural system but, as Sherman observed, these indicators are not valid premises on which to build a case of economic non-viability. Many analysts that in Eritrea the possibilities for large-scale agricultural development are limited. Often cited as reasons for the IOW level of agricultural production are the traditional land tenure systems and the unscientific farming methods in use in the country. Should Eritrea become independent, neither of these practices will necessarily continue, under the Liberation Movement's economic program Ming. Sherman 1980. Furthermore, the lack of adequate rainfall can overcome in Mount Terwas Eritrea through a long-term program of water conservation by building dams, reservoirs, and irrigational *MS as has been successfully done in some other countries. Also, the extensive potash reserves as fertilizer in the country will contribute greatly to agricultural yield in the future. Indicators of non-viability are, at only problems that can, in the long run, solved. Thus, the hypothesis that Eritrea can root feed its population has based on political and technological considerations rather than objective agricultural potential. Italian colonial was mainly concerned with sourcing cash crops for the Italian market. In the past, therefore, political decisions actually determined to what extent Eritrea could feed its PK. Sherman 1980:112 Agriculture is the of the Eritrean economy. The viable existence of Eritrea rests largely on the development of its agricultural resources. Even its potential for industrial development is highly related to the development of its agricultural. The cultivable land is comparatively small. Most of it is in the climatically suitable highland, where intensive farming is carried out. See Table L. Most of the cereals and vegetables is consumed locally, whereas the major pan of fruit and oilseed and Luxion has always been exported to Urals and neighboring countries. The lack of large-scale irrigation projects has so far prevented the realization of higher production levels, which could have greatly improved the country's capacity to feed its growing population. The UN Commission for Eritrea recognized this problem in 1950 when it assessed the situation. It has been estimated that if and when increases in cultivable acreage which are technically possible could be accomplished, 40,000 additional tons of grain crops could be produced. This would more than meet the existing cereal deficit. UN 1950:77 The agricultural sector consists of two parts, the traditional and the modern. The traditional has been engaged for ages in subsistence agriculture and is concentrated in the highlands, where the climate and the sedentary lifestyle are suitable. The traditional land tenure system of the highlands can broadly divided into the risti, and the risti is a form of private ownership, where land is wd by a particular family, and cannot be sold or otherwise alienated except with the consent of that family. This system of land holding is the minor one, the dominant one being the dasa system. This is usually described as a communal system of tenure. In principle, it is a system where land is held by the village in common and is redistributed every 7 years in order to take account of changing needs of the families of the village. Barnett 1980:112 The land tenure system and primitive farming techniques have been identified as the cause of low production levels in the traditional sector, indicating the necessity for fundamental reforms in order to bring ANLLT higher levels of agricultural productivity. Recognizing this, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front has already instituted far-reaching land reform programs in these areas with positive results. The significant point that one should bear in mind here is that the extensive agricultural lands that we have liberated and put to our own use today had for too long been snatched away from our peasant masses by the colonialists and their feudal collaborators. Hence, the EPLF has returned most of this land to the poor peasants. It is also carrying essential land reform in the countryside. In many villages, the inequitable system of land ownership is being radically changed. Landless peasants have received land and a new opportunity to develop production and improve their livelihood. 11. TIAE, there are projects to establish agricultural cooperatives that will nurture the spirit of collective labor and production, which are the basis for the building of our national EPLF. Initially, part of the village lands was distributed in small plots to landless peasants by the EPLF. It was thought that ownership of the land would result in higher production. Another plan was reserved collective farming by the villagers. Large agricultural estates or plantations, if any, were run by tier front to RLET its own food requirements. But the emphasis was on development of collective farming and cooperative associations. Introduction of new equipment and methods of farming into the traditional sector greatly enhanced potential. Alongside the traditional agricultural sector, has existed a sector made up mainly of European plantations, estates, and other commercial farms, mostly located in the former dominial lands of the lowlands. In 1969, there were agricultural concession contracts, and they are given for pericoles ranging from 9 to years. Addis Ababa 1969-31. Most of these large estates were engaged in the production of fruits, vegetable, and dairy products, and they Ethiopia valuable foreign exchange for many years until many of them fell into the hands of the Litvration fronts. Under the leadership of the fronts, production was mainly used to meet the domestic market requirements. The total area of large-scale farming of 7 large agricultural estates or concessions alone are known to 40,000 hectares, 988,000 acres. This leaves more than 550 other smaller modern farms, covering more than the total acreage of the large estates. Commercial farms cover more than the acres cited by the UN Commission. Eritrea, see Table 2. Recent studies of potentially cultivable area in the western lowlands alone has revealed that the agricultural potential of Eritrea is much greater than was previously assumed. That can extensively developed by drilling wells for an underground water supply by making full use of water from nearby rivers. These are fertile and expansive as well. The best are the Tessani Gulaj Plain, T**tween the Gash Seti River, comprising 120,000 hectares, 100,000 bashis or bashika, 45.000 hectares, the Gash Valley hectares, and Mansura, 25,000 hectares. Sherman 1980, 117. All in all, the cultivable area of Eritrea is nearly out of early 3 million acres was in use by early 1970. Thus the portrayal of Eritrea as an agriculturally poor farming country, short of water and short of cultivable land, not have any basis in light of these simple facts. Its potential, if is in its agricultural productive capacity to provide not only for its own requirements but to serve as a essential exporter to neighboring Arab and African markets. Agriculture's central position in the economy is well understood by the liberation forces fighting for Eritrean independence. With policies and needed construction of irrigation facilities, Eritrea would agriculturally, and Eritrea, with a population of 3.5 million and an area of 124,320 square kilometers, 47,754 miles, is a small country. Hence, its for economic viability after is cast in doubt. Yet there are at least 62 United Nations state surface areas xe less than thx of Eritrea. UN more relevant is the fact that 18 of them with ostensibly viable national economies are in Africa. Similarly, 40 out of these 62 countries have also population less than that of Eritrea. UN 1980. With the exception of Malawi, Rwanda, and Burundi. The 14 other African nations are less populated than Eritrea. More specifically, UN nations have population figures smaller than that of Eritrea. 22 of them are African nations as shown in Table 3. The problems of small size can even by emphasizing economic activities that can utilize the advantages of even small. Development of small trade especially with neighbors offers a big revenue potential for Eritrea. Tourism from scorched Arab lands. The Red Sea has a great potential. The success in this by neighboring tiny island nation of Seychelles in the Indian Ocean is a good example. In addition, Eritrea's location contributes to its economic ability. It is strategically located at the southern mouth of the Red Sea leading to the Suez Canal and has two excellent ports. The Eritrean coastline is 100 km long. And at southern tip of the country, the Red Sea narrows at the strand of Bab el-Mandeb, the Gate of Sorrow, to only about 18 through it pass daily at least 70 Eurasian going vessels carrying oil for Euro F. Kaplan 1978 S19. Eritrea's proximity to the rich Middle East and its current status as the storm eye of the turbulent Horn of Africa offer extensive economic opportunities. On the other hand, external political mess on its internal politics and economy could have effects wrecking for unity and economic development of the country. Some Arab countries already covertly interfere in the Eritrean struggle. The EPLF has successfully with this, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates and have not ceased using their petrodollars to supply their own protégés in the country to ensure their influence in an independent Eritrea. As the struggle nears, many of these nations will probably only vie for influence in the internal affairs of Eritrea. This can seriously threaten its economic viability and independent existence. Resources or Eritrea is with a variety or mineral resources whose exploitation for commercial purposes, with the extraction of salt, gold recently COP/FR, has yet fully realized. It has a long history of gold, salt and iron iron ore, liquefied iron ore renostly in the hydrothermal rock formations of eastern Eritrea and the residual formity NS in central highlands to the south of Asmara. Specifically, metric tons of iron are found in ISKMS south of port of Masaya, and covers an area of square kills. Rudy's 1964. The UN estimated it at more than metric tons. UN, 1976. The average metallic content of the Gedem ore ranges from about 46% to 59%. Yosinai 1952. The second iron ore field, with an estimated reserve of metric tons, stretches from south of Asmara along the Syriakale-Goze provincial order. Another iron is mined from Statafid rock formation in the Felsat Valley in the northern #NCE of Sahel and the Sabub Agameta area and Semharp Province and constitute by far the largest iron ore deposit in Eritrea. Bibolini 1921 Kjellin 1966:245. The Val. Lay reserves were estimated in 1920 to be about 500,000 metric tons of ore with more than metallic content, and recent estimates confirm the original estimate. The Sabub Agameta belt was mined from 1915 to 1921 by an Italian mining ORM called Società Mineralia dell'Agameta. It made a thorough survey to determine the extent of the reserves that were later verified by the Rudy's Mining Association in 1964 to about metric tons with a metallic content of from 59.57% to about 62%. Rudy's 1964. Thus, the total estimated reserves of iron ore Deb3 sits found in stratified rock formations in Eritrea up to 1964 amount to about metric tons. These three iron ore belts have total reserves up to about metric tons. Jalenk 1966:243. Copper, the kind of copper ore consists mainly of ores found in stratified rock formations in the southern areas of the Central Highlands. There are three main belts of this copper ore. First, The Reba Belt near the Ansaba River in Barka province covers a general area of about 40 knolls in length with a grade ore of about 0.5%. The total reserves have not yet been estimated. Second, the Adi Rasi copper deposits, near the village of Adinafas in Siri province, were by far the largest copper deposits found in the country up to 1966. Copper comes in combination with gold, nickel, and sulfur minerals, and the history of copper exploitation in this area goes back to early Egyptian and Portuguese visits of the area. Jalenk 1966:243. Some of the companies that have explored the area for commercial purposes include Miniere Aurifera Eritrea Società Italiana Anonima, Mygia, 1938-39, Verdi Brothers. 1946, MIG. Leota of New York, 1948, Newmont Exploration Ltd. 1956-7, Texas Africa Exploration Co. 1958, International Nickel Company, 1962, and Atkinson Consulting Engineers, USA, 1963. According to Atkins, the total estimate of the Adi Rasi copper deposits is believed to be about metric tons. Jalenk I 966:230. To Dale, the Adi Rasi deposits have not yet been commercially mined. Third, the D. Bearway copper fields located in and around the town of Debar Wa in Siri province were discovered after 1966. It is believed to be an extension the copper deposits to the south and southeast PFD Bearway, and, with a grade ore of 7.8%, is one of the richest fields in the world, whereas the Zambia Zaire copper field has only 4.8% ore grade. Though detailed data are not given out by the Ethiopian government for political reasons, it signed a joint venture agreement with the Nippon Koiko, a Japanese multinational corporation, to mine the D. Bearway deposits in 1973. Before its Ford closure in 1975, the estimated copper deposits were 17,000 metric tons. 1980:120. The total copper metal reserves are estimated at metric tons. Eritrea 1975. Gold, another economically significant mineral resource, is gold. Gold mining has a history that extends back to pharaonic Egypt. But the relevant H* story for our purposes begins with the Italian colonization in 1889. In 1901, an Italian mining IRM by the name Società Eritrea per le Miniere d'Oro started mining at 4 spots in the northern outskirts BF Asmara, that is, A. Madrizine, Adi Shamagia, Adi Kanza, and Adi Nafas. Later, it was bought up by another Italian mining company called Sindacato del Miniere Aurifera di Turin, SMAC. SMAC started large-scale mining in these areas in 1931. Other smaller companies existed during the Italian colonial era throughout the country. Nearly all the gold deposits in Eritrea are concentrated in the stratified rocks of the area surrounding Asmara above river valleys of Gash and Barka. More tyri are found in Fal. Zational problems, and serious effort to exploit this resource has since been made. Finally, the possible existence of petroleum and natural gas in Eritrea has been a subject of civculation and much controversy. In the best indications of their presence date back to 1868 around Masaya. Impergil 1968:225. In 1958, Naftaplim, a Yugoslav petroleum exploration and production enterprise, was given a contract to exploit nearly 20,000 square km area on the Red Sea offshore north and south of Masaya for oil. Imperial 1968:517. Findings were inconclusive. Then, other contracts were given to Mobil Oil and Gulf Oil in 1963, and a few years later, to Tanico Oil Co. Although no oil or natural gas has yet been discovered, the PMSRXCTSR until recently exploration for oil was being undertaken on behalf of the Ethiopian government. As the 1966 Ministry of Mines report concluded, the prospecting and exploration discussed at 3VE support the conclusion that the tertiary sediments of the Red Sea coastal area offer enticing possibilities of petroleum and natural gas. Imperial 1968:529. Finally, the possible existence of petroleum and natural gas in Eritrea has been a subject of speculation and much controversy in the past. Indications of their presence date back to 1868 around Masaya. Other natural resources. Eritrea is also moderately endowed with several types of land resources such as forest wealth, wildlife, and water resources. According to data furnished by the British administration to the UN Commissioner for Eritrea, roughly about 5% of the country is forest. UN 1980:76. Although this is a relatively small area, it is a source of important economic benefits as the colonial economic history of Eritrea under Italian rule shows. The dum plant along the banks of the Gash and Barka rivers have supplied the necessary raw materials for the mat making and button manufacturing firms in Eritrea since early 1930s. Nearly all wood and paper making factories use local forest, sisal plants gave. Most production halted by British administration during 194,142 Geriodi. Lowing 7 areas, Lower Gash River Basin, where the Ugaro mine is located, Basin of the Seti River, Basin of the Barka River, watershed between the Gash and the Barka Rivers, Basin of the Ansaba River, Hamasine Highlands, constituting the largest and richest gold fields with at least 110 known sites, and Basin of the River Marab, Jelen 1966:135-207, 344_345. Other commercially important mineral resources are saline deposits, mica, zinc, nickel, asbestos, kaolin, manganese, magnesium, titanium, marble, feldspar, potash, and possibly oil offshore from Masaya. Sherman 1980:119, of these, potash and the possibility of oil reserves deserve some elaboration. Potash, found in large quantities in the Danakil lowlands, is an important source of national wealth. Of specific economic significance is the associated hydrothermal power that can be as a source of energy. The mine is found in a volcanic area known as Dalil on the border between Eritrea and Ethiopia. It covers an area 200 km long and 30 km wide. There are no recent estimates, but in 1966 estimates put known reserves at an annual production of tons, as amongst the highest in the world in an area lying on both sides of the border, Jelen 1966:497. In 1960, Ethiopia leased the mining rights to an American company called Parsons Co., and by 1973, the expected date for full-scale operation, Ethiopia was anticipating port revenue from potash mining of more than US 23 million, Jelen, but Parsons soon quit the operation due to political and organizational pressure. Eritrea could safely considered as self-sufficient in wood products building purposes, as is consistently shown by the absence of any such IRNL NMTS. As a source of fuel in the countryside is adequate for needs. Yet the need for a large afforestation program in the denuded of Eritrea, is evident if the supply of wood-related raw materials is to continue to meet the needs. The importance of the availability and use of water resources in Eritrea is great. Not only is drinking water in the Semidesan lowlands a scarce resource, but the erosion producing now of rivers and streams from the highlands is not yet adequately controlled to irrigate the numerous valleys and flatlands for the desired economic benefits. Some of the rivers have been dammed and used to support irrigated agriculture, especially in the eastern lowlands of Semenawi Bari and the Tessin Sea Ali Gider areas of western lowlands, UN 1980:76. The rainfall pattern in the highlands is an extension of the same pattern of the Ethiopian highlands, and with a range of 250 NLLN/year to 875 mm/year is considered adequate. But in the Iolands, rainfall is inadequate, and the potential for greater agricultural output there lies in the extensive development of irrigation. Another natural resource with great economic significance is the sea. During Italian rule, the fishing of sardines and mother of pearl had some commercial value, but, according to Ethiopian sources, the Red Sea abounds with other commercially important fish like Red Sea sprat, Red Sea anchovy, pink bream, lizardfish, red queenfish or jack, gray mullet, grouper, rock chini, sea bass, barracudas, sharks. Some shrimp, cuttlefish, crayfish and lobsters. Addis Ababa 1968:46, by 1969, there were about 15 firms engaged in the fishing industry producing dry fish and fish meal products, mostly for the export market. The largest corporation at the time, the Red Sea Development Corporation. 4,000 tons of fish meal and ions of fresh fish annually, and the international demand for these products is considered high. The fish meal produced in Eritrea is of high quality and is in great demand. It is used as food for livestock and poultry. And it is an important export item. Fish meal is exported to countries like United Kingdom, Italy, Switzerland, USA, Greece, Singapore, and Ceylon. Addis Ababa 1968:47, although the export market may have considerably shrunk in recent years due to war conditions, the potential for its future exploitation is there. Salt is another marine resource in Eritrea. It is extracted by evaporating the highly saline waters of the Red Sea. Major extracting activities were undertaken by tile Italians in the port towns of Uakaro and Massawa. Le Saline di Massawa, the largest firm established in 1905, had an annual production of about 100,000 tons, Sherman 1980, 121, part of which was being exported to the Far East and neighboring African countries. However, the scale of production has been drastically reduced because of the war. Finally, Eritrea's animal wealth is economically significant. Since the country is basically agricultural, livestock is a crucial economic resource. Even though there is a serious lack of data about the different types of livestock, there are millions of cattle, sheep, and goats. In addition, there are hundreds of thousands of camels, donkeys, horses, and mules. See Table 5. Some efforts by the Italians to control animal diseases in Eritrea contributed positively to the growth of livestock. These services deteriorated during the Ethiopian rule, but efforts by the liberation movements to undertake widespread vaccination campaigns against such animal diseases as rinderpest, anthrax, and trichinosis, and the active training of veterinary technicians are steps in the right direction. EPLF infrastructure and institutions. The Eritrean infrastructure was established primarily by the Italians. Extensive construction was undertaken to develop the Crown Colony for the purpose of permanent resettlement of millions of Italians and as a springboard for further expansion into Africa. The Italians set out to connect every part of the colony by roads, railways, and telephone systems. The construction of the railway system, started in 1887, had by 1932 succeeded in connecting major urban centers of Massawa, Ginda, Nefesit, Asmara, Kirkton, Agordat, and Bishia. Its total length was 352 km. Similarly, the road system initially consisted of 550 km of all-weather roads and about 2.411 km of seasonal roads. A 71 km was constructed in joining the PON of Massawa with Asmara on the highlands, making it the longest in the world at the time. Extensive improvement of the port facilities was also undertaken. But under the British administration, the PON facilities began to deteriorate, and no substantial improvement of the transport facilities were made. The main preoccupation of the Ethiopian rule, on the other hand, was to maintain the Italian-built transportation network without any additions. This persisted until the mid-70s, when the escalation of the conflict led to widespread deterioration of the roads. The rails in the railroad system were pulled out for use in fortification of garrisons, and many bridges were blown up high both sides at the height of the war. The result is that, a major reconstruction of the railway system would necessary if service is to resume once again. One exception to this was the building by liberation fronts, particularly the EPLF, in the areas under their control. Of special significance, Isa I 500 km long highway called Litekrashen Road constructed by the EPLF in 1977, and many others like the famous Challenge Road with 37 switchbacks in only 12 kms, in the country, EPLF, 1977b, 10. Development of relatively large of urban centers in the country with adequate municipal services is another factor that can contribute to its viability. In most of the cities and towns built by the eons, services such as water supply, electricity, telephone * service, sewage disposal, mail services and mass transportation systems were instituted. Necessary social services such as public education, police protection, and medical services were introduced. When the Italians left in 1941, the British made improvements in these public services, especially education. Many of the Italian schools had by then been instrumental in bringing about an intelligentsia that later became active in the political struggle for independence. Many former students became the bureaucrats and technocrats of the Eritrean government, which briefly functioned from 1952 to 1962. Some even migrated into Ethiopia to become prominent émigré bureaucrats in the feudal kingdom. Similarly, Italian instituted health facilities were expanded under the British rule. Rural clinics were opened and the federal era saw an expansion of health personnel, especially midwives, dressers, and health officers. At present, nearly all the cities are under Ethiopian control. And because Ethiopia has made the war its primary concern, most of the services mentioned in VE are in bad condition. Schools are closed for most of the year, with the only significant chmling taking place in the countryside where the guerrilla forces are in control. Roads are in disrepair and heavy tanks and cars roam city streets in the major towns. The economic warfare waged between the contending One Horn of Africa Volume 6, Number 2 forces in the conflict has resulted in the destruction of communication lines, and mail distribution vices, and even the occasional loss of electric wire services. Therefore, even though the major work in the institutionalization of basic city services was undertaken by the European colonizers, the Ethio-Eritrea conflict has inflicted heavy damages on these services, making future rebuilding FLOTS inexpensive. Lastly, the colonizers initiated important financial and governmental institutions, such as banking and finance services, and insurar facilities that are essential at an orderly functioning and economy. Though the British were notorious for their deliberate suppression of economic development by making any large-scale development impossible by restricting the freedom of the banks to issue loans, Travisk's tier Ethiopians relaxed of these restrictions. Several Ethiopian and foreign banks carry active financial institutions once again. Yet at the same time, a few institutions unique to Eritrea's colonial heritage, like the Bunda sanitation and vaccination teams, Forest Guard Service Dal Gardi Forstali, and the experimental farm networks were slowly disbanded by Ethiopia, even though Trier presence served to fulfill needs emanating from tier agricultural characteristics of Eritrea. In the liberated zones, the EPLF is in the of building the necessary institutional requirements to run the economy UNNR its control. Hutart 1982:99, a de facto government in exile with all the bureaucracies, rules, and regulations. The relationship between the various institutions and the ones to enforce them already exists in the EPLF. Many governments have been set up in villages to carry out the various governmental functions in running local affairs. Monetarations are minimized to the obvious inconveniences due to the absence of banks and a national EY. In general, efforts are being by the guerrilla forces to establish systems of governmental institutions that will needed in an independent Eritrea. No economic plans or violent projects can attain the desired goals without the appropriate infrastructure and institutions. Thus, the initiation and upkeep of the necessary institutions and infrastructure in Eritrea are very important for future growth. It is author's judgment that relatively well infrastructure necessary for the viable functioning of the Eritrean economy already exists. The force's commitment to further development and immersiveness of existing infrastructure their and activities is an indication of future plans for the development and reconstruction of the damaged or non-existent infrastructures institutions. We have analyzed in detail the major economic factors that directly deal with the potential for viability of an once-and Eritrean national economy. The historical background trend: the allegation of a non-viable economy reveals a strong political incentive on the pool of the powers that ruled Eritrea. Not only Eritrea's economic resources is sufficient to a sustainable economic growth for the 3.5 million inhabitants, but that there exists a strong possibility of a healthy export market to other countries. Of especially economic significance for such a potential is the excess of rich mineral, deposits and the infrastructural requirements for its exploitation. In conclusion, it is important to that final of the situation strongly imike its viable Eritrean economy for an independent and TQMRY. The economic resources of country and its infrastructural maturity will enable an Eritrean economy to function viably. Thus, allegation of a weak, non-viable Eritrean economy is just an allegation concocted by Ethiopia its allies in the 1940s and early 1950s purely FKI reasons. In with * equate long-range projects on irrigation, mining, and industrial rehabilitation, Eritrea could potentially supply VES perxics and services to neighboring countries. Pre-colonial Eritrea was overwhelmingly rural. By the end of European rule in 1952, about 20% of the nation's population had become urbanized. The effect of the capitalist colonialism on rural Visasan society is rarely studied. The aim of this article is to shed light on this important aspect of rural development, as it has always been the mainstay of Eritrean nationalism. The article will be divided into 3 sections. The first part will deal with the commoditization of African labor. The examples of alienation of land, the building of communication infrastructures, and the introduction of military services will use to illustrate the commoditization process. Due to European rule, the traditional arrangement of labor organization was profoundly affected. This was to have a chilling effect on the political economy of the Eritrean rural society. Section 2 will discuss the actual process of disintegration of the traditional production relations and the resultant economic and political radicalization of the revascent population. The final section will deal with the generalization of peasant revolts and with feudal Ethiopia's attempt to weaken Eritrea's resolve for independence by sowing ideological discord among the peasant. The objective historical process began in Eritrea by capitalist colonialism was irreversible despite Ethiopia's attempt to arrest socio-economic progress and preserve the anachronistic feudal arrangement in the nation. At present, one of the main reasons for the success of the EPLF is that it advanced the present interest beyond the possibilities created for this class by capitalist colonials. For this reason and the fact that the peasant question is really the question of nation building, the study of the peasant socio-economic, organizational change during the colonial becomes basic to understanding of the Eritrean nationalism as well as the nation's aspiration for independence and pro-Italian impact on Eritrean labor. Alienation of land. The Italian goal in Eritrean was to make it a permanent colony. To this end, Italy encouraged the surplus Italian population to settle in Eritrea. Italians began immigrating to Eritrea at the start of the 20th century. Their influx steadily increased over the years. Prior to 1930, the Italian population was by 1935 it reached 50,000, and 70,000 by 1941, Travasky's 1960:22. From the beginning, the Italian colonial government tampered with the traditional land tenure system. It urged the alienation of land and converted much of it to government land. By February 7, 1923, the Italian government defined the land that was to the exclusive pre-XRTY of the colonizing state. According to a report of the Ethiopian government, the Italian state considered government land to a. all types of roads constructed by the government, b. seashores, ports, tea sachets and forests, c. telegraphic lines, telephone lines and river courses, d. lands which belonged to certain extinct tribes, or which did belong to other tribes or families, e. Lands which belong to the former government, 0 forests and WCXDS, over which no rights have been reserved for a sedentary, e. Mines. Excavations, salt mines with the exception of the land rights, h. Lands on the eastern and western lowlands, provided that they are not inhabited by a sedentary Rixopol. A subsidiary legislation on T above decree qualified the government lands in the eastern and western lowlands in the following manner: a. In the eastern lowlands, lands found below an altitude of 350 meters, and b. In the western lowlands, lands found an altitude of so 850 meters, were declared govern*NT lands, Ltd. 1969:42. In addition to this, almost all meadows were government-owned. In areas lands lying within 50 meters of both banks of a river are also claimed as government land. Ltd 1969:42. Traditionally tribal lands between Ginda and Masawa also became crown land. According to Araya, 1977, in the final analysis, at least one half of entire Eritrean area was under the legal control of the Italian government, especially fertile land. And it was exclusively placed under Italian control and distributed among Italian settlers. Italian alienation of land in the Highland Plateau created such a scarcity that the government was forced to increase the DISA land tenure system in this region, Natal 1946, TD 1969, Zacharias 1966, Travaskis 1960. The pheasant population was being increasingly affected. The lack of land to cultivate, or the severe scarcity of land, led many Isacents to seek employment elsewhere. Land owned by the Coptic Church was also affected. Prior to Italian rule, the Church was one of the most powerful land-owning institutions in the highlands. Favored by seasonal rains, the most fertile land in Eritrea, the Bar Medfi area, was owned by Church. The Italians converted it into crown land, thereby reducing the material strength of the Coptic Church. Some of it was leased to Vrazants and to Italian settlers. In effect, the Church as an economic power was destroyed. The impact on rural social life and class structure was tremendous. As Travaskis notes, during the British rule, 1941–1952, the Church petitioned the new administrator in vain for the freedom of its land. Only union with Ethiopia and the favor of its traditional protector, the Emperor of Ethiopia, could now restore its property to the Church. Travaskis. The Church became one of the major advocates of the union with Ethiopia, FPC 1948, Ellenson 1977, and the Ethiopian crown supported it in this venture. But this contradiction, into motion by Italian colonialism, was such that the rural areas the scene of armed uprisings against the return of the old social structure and feudal social formations, Halliday 1971, Kramer 1969, Laban 1972. With the creation of Crown Land, Large-Scale Volume 6, Number 2 Horn of Africa/51 mechanized agriculture was introduced with zonal labor in demand. Commercial cash crops were introduced. In the Baraka lowlands, an agriculture enterprise employing IOO regular workers and 6,000 seasonal workers was set up in the 1920s, ELF, ND. Products such as tobacco were then exported to the Congo, Italy, and Britain. Some nomad were forced to supplement their incomes by wage earners while others were forced to earn their living by employment. Thus, capitalist agriculture in the rural areas created new forms of social living and brought new experiences to rural life. This was far from a smooth process. Resistance against the Italian rule of rural life continued. But what was in the making was the decay and disintegration of old forms of production and social relations and, in its place, colonial forms of capitalist production and socio-economic relations. The resistance against this change shaped peasant experiences in the countryside. In addition to creating a demand for agricultural labor, the Italians introduced new crops and improved the condition of the old ones. Raising livestock was the greatest wealth of the Eritrean economy in the field of agriculture. The Italians increased the potential for economic exploitation by introducing veterinary services, and increased livestock was the greatest wealth of the Eritrean Commission Report, 1950, 74. Even though this increase primarily benefited the Italian settlers, its influence on the rural life was apparent. The commercialization of agriculture, including livestock, and the introduction of scientific methods to improve the health and productivity potentials of the livestock, was a new experience for the Eritrean peasantry at large. In the lowlands of Eritrea bordering the Sudan, acres were planted with cotton, and coffee plantations were introduced. By 1950, thousands of acres were given to the Italian market gardeners. Not only did agricultural production increase, but the 52/Horn of Africa Volume 6, Number 2 import of agricultural products was made possible, 4 Power 1952, Travasky's 1960:40. Both the conversion of alienated land into crown land and the introduction of commercialized agriculture and consequences for the rural economy and rural social structure. These and other changes hastened the disintegration of traditional Beni Amer socio-economic structure in the lowlands and the feudal social structure in the highlands. Infrastructural growth in Eritrea. By 1920 the colony of Eritrea possesses more wagon roads than all other Red Sea political divisions combined, Southard 1920:30. All-weather roads and additional dry-weather roads stretching out from Asmara connected several areas in Eritrea. This not only made Eritrea an increasingly unified economic and political unit, but facilitated potential external trade and commercial intercourse. Along these roads and railroads new towns were created or old villages transformed into important commercial towns. In addition to railroads and roads, two important modern airports, one in Asmara and the other in the newly founded company town of Guru, were built. The construction of schools throughout the country must also be mentioned. The urban population prior to the Italian colonialism was negligible, yet, by 1941, 1/5 of the Eritrean population was urbanized. Massawa became one of the most important and busiest ponds in the Red Sea area. These developments created an unprecedented demand for labor. Prior to the Italian occupation, the Eritrean population was predominantly rural. In the lowlands areas almost all the people were nomadic, whereas, in the highland, the population was predominantly rural peasantry. Between 1890 and 1941 was the era of urbanization, industrialization, and commercialization of agriculture. Italy introduced a forced labor law to meet the demand of labor created by Italian capital, Araya 1978. Although no documented history of Eritrean labor participation in the building of this infrastructure is available, we can conclude that many peasants were involved in such a venture. The alienation of land and its conversion into crown land had a double purpose. It safeguarded Italian interests in settlement and, by making land a scarce commodity, it forced landless peasants to seek employment in the new job market created by Italian capital. Military build-up. Italy was involved in at least two major wars while administering Eritrea. The first, with the newly founded empire or Ethiopia, ended in its defeat at the Battle of Adown in 1896. Menelik, who led the Ethiopian contingent, had amassed about 200,000 soldiers. The Italian war preparation was also massive, involving thousands of Eritrean soldiers in the colonial armies, Dilbo 1974. As early as 1893, the Italians were preparing for war with Ethiopia, and an intensive militarization of the Eritrean population took place, Ver 1967:244. The more important war occurred during World War I. Here, the Italians made massive preparations using Eritrea as a base for their militaristic venture. Italian strength before 1935 included air strength of 300 to 500 aeroplanes, besides 100,0 natives to be mobilized in two colonies, about 50,000 from each, Bataglio 1937:11. The two colonies were Somalia and Eritrea. 4 Eritrean divisions were established. One Eritrean brigade with 20 battalions and 89 field guns was formed to attack Ethiopia, Bataglio 1937:2930. Bataglio underestimated the number of Eritreans who died in action, Boca 1965:75, the number of defections in the Italian army during the war, Boca 1965, 122, 197, Dilbo 1974, Steer 1937, 174-5, and the number of Eritreans in the colonial army, Bataglio 1937:11. It was only by using Eritrea as a base and employing thousands of Eritrean soldiers that Italy was able to succeed in colonizing Ethiopia for a brief period, Barker 1968. Conscription into the Italian army meant special privileges for the Eritrean soldiers: tax exemption, exemption from traditional dues and obligations. Scarcity of land and lack of employment was a factor which encouraged Eritreans into military service. Travaskis 1960. In addition, there were certain rewards for military service, such as pensions or promotions to chief officers. When the war was over for Italy in 1941, the disbandment offered the gravest threat to law and order since the Italians had first pacified the country. Eritrea was overrun with ex-soldiers, who were either without work or found civilian life ungenial and unrewarding. Many had returned home with rifles, ammunition, and hand grenades, which they hoarded against the future. Ands lay abandoned on the battlefields and concealed in a variety of weakly dispersed stores and caches. The balance was tibxd dangerously in favor of disorder, Travaskis 1960:105. Peasant insubordination and revolts increased in the lowland and the Gash-Setet area. Well-armed raids common, scurrying in the highlands, especially those bordering Ethiopia, Travaskis 1960, IOS. The ex-soldiers affected the rural nomics in other ways. Rural agricultural production increased, sometimes tremendously after 1941. Rural labor, scarce during the war, now increased because of the end of the war. The most effective stimuli to production were the return of thousands of ex-soldiers to the land. By 1946, 640,000 acres were under cultivation as against 141,000 acres in 1939, the grain crop traying 118.000 tons as against 28,500 tons, Travaskis 1960:40. The input of Italian colonialism in Eritrea and the transformation of the Eritrean rural life in general was felt by the end of the war. After 50 years of Italian rule, the material base of the rural life was undergoing a profound change. The 1941-1952 X-Riad, therefore, was crucial for Eritrea as its fate was being decided by the United Nations. On the one hand, there was the Eritrean people's desire to determine their own destiny and, on the other, there was the imperial Ethiopian crown's desire to annex and colonize Eritrea. Although the former was the backing of the masses, the latter also had support in the lowlands and highlands of Eritrea. This contradiction is most vivid in the countryside among the peasants and is the basic change that has taken place in these areas. We will cite examples from Beniamer and Kebesa Soci-Cty. From 1941 to 1951, a war was being fought in the rural areas to destroy the old forms of socio-economic relations. 1941 to 1952 period General, and western provinces. The provinces of Hamzian, Sarai, and Akele Goze comprise the Kebesa area. The people in these regions speak Tigrinya and Coptic Christians. According to a British administrative census of 1952, out of the total population of 524,000, 487,000 are Christians and 37,000 Muslims. Out of the total population, 101,000 Christians and Muslims lived in the urban centers, principally Asmara, Adi, Yugri, Adi Kuala, Adi Kirk, Senate, Travaskis 19601932. N.E. Fabian Report, Gray and Subraman, eds. 1948, cites that the population in the Kebesa area totaled 448,000. Out of this, the Muslim population numbered 58,000, the rest Coptic Christians. Out of the total population, 35,000 lived, According to this report, in Asmara alone, Gray and Silbermann, eds. 1948.12, discrepancies in population counts are frequent for this period. The point of agreement, however, is that the Muslim population in this area was insignificant, especially in the rural areas since most of them lived in urban areas. The rural dwellers of Hamzian, Sarai and Akale Goze are hence followers of the Coptic Church. The reverse is true in the western provinces of Sahel and the Baraka lowlands. The British census estimated a total population of this, and respectively, were Muslims and Christians. The total urban population was, Travasky's 1960:132. According to the Fabian report, the total population was 367,000, with 336,000 Muslims and 31,000 Christians. Gray and Silbermann 1948:12-13. The Baraka lowlands were almost totally Muslim, as was the case in the Sahel province. In the western provinces, the people were pastoral nomads and urbanism was less developed. Here, the center of social, political, and economic division was not territorial but descent and kinship. By tradition, the management of tribal affairs was bestowed upon the council of elders and hereditary chiefs. Serf population made up 90% of population. They were subject to customary dues and obligations to the ruling caste who, in turn, gave the necessary protection and leadership to them. In the Highland Plateau, social, political, and nomic organization centered around Resti and the Enda. Territorial organization and village centers were the focal points of social living into sedentary agriculturalist Coptic Christian communities. The in which the villagers went about conducting their socio-economic affairs was democratic in form. Although the manner in which the plateau villagers manage their affairs is democratic, in that parochial powers are customarily vested in elected council of elders and not in hereditary chiefs, the passage of time has brought with it a sharp class distinction between those who, having no connection with the landowning, are regarded as tenants. Gray and Silbermann 1948:13. Among the most powerful groups we have mentioned are the Coptic Church and some Balabats. In general, we have discussed how the Italian policy of forced iyatsur and confiscation of land rived the traditional landowning class of their Biwar base. Here we have to more the Italians were specific, i.e. very hard on the Coptic Church and some traditional feudal lords in the Kedrza region for reasons we will explain below. But since the Italian policy was geared toward exploiting Eritrea Arki, emanding colonial in which to settle its Italian surplus population, Gray and 1948:22, the method of direct and indirect rule were used. The Fabian report summarizes this process. And functions of these chiefs remained unchanged throughout the of Italian rule. Apart from exercising limited judicial powers with regard to simpler types of civil disputes and collecting the annual tribute, Tre did nothing but obey orders and submit response. No attempt was made to train chiefs in the exercise of greater administrative responsibilities and no additional responsibilities were placed upon them. At the Sunatinv, for supposed of sacrosanct and native custom, chiefs were allowed a free rein regards the exercise of traditional privileges. In the of the West, the chiefs and aristocratic classes continued to levy feudal dues from their *RFS, and to enjoy many of the privileges. In the Trits of the West, the chiefs and aristocratic classes continued to levy feudal dues from their serfs, and to enjoy many of the PRI which they had enjoyed the Italian occupation. On the plateau, the old customary privileges with which rulers had been endowed were inherited by their less powerful successors. Gray and eds 1948:20. The Kabesa region in 1935, the population of Asmara was a mere 15,000. In 1941, it rose to most of the Inwas due to the immigration of Phazants seeking employment in the cities. The increase was also due to the return of the ex-soldiers after end of the war in 1941. In addition, Ethiopians, Italians, and Arabs came to settle in Asmara during this period. The rural of Southern Plateau, which was 123,000 in 1910, is in 1948. The apparent paradox has risen because landless groups, often immigrants from Ethiopia, were sought times by village communities to make go the loss of manpower caused by military conscription and exfus the towns, Gray and 1948:24. The immigration was mostly from Tigray province of northern Ethiopia. These immigrants belonged to Coptic Church and speak basically the Sarwani language as the folk of Ketsa. By and large, they Maklayalite were at the of rural class str teacher. The British, as ruler, felt that they had right jurisdiction over the crown land. It remained the property of the state and Italian farmers, Travasky's 1960:54. In most where there was land at the dis of the British, they all craded, not to the Eritreans, but to those best qualified and equipped to use it, nanrally, the Italians, Travasky's 1960:54. In this case, the contradiction between the Eritrean Vrazentry and the Italian rural urgewasi became acute. Between 1942 and 1944 many stances of actual conflict between them were recorded. In 1942 a fruit garden cultivated by the Italians was destroyed by the in 1944 two Italian farmers were killed. Halophobia became vivid in tier rural areas during this period, Travasky's 1060:55. As we have frequently mentioned, the Ket *SSA Rappel were primarily Christians and agriculturalists. Since by custom, only Christians were entitled to land rights, with a few exceptions, professions other than tilling the land were regarded as occupations for outsiders. The moneylenders, the shop owners, the traders, in short, the financial wizards of the rural areas, were Muslims, especially the Liberty Muslims. During this critical period the Ivasantry had become heavily indebted to these traders. By 1944, whole villages had mortgaged their crops before they had been sown. Travasky's 1960:55, underscore further, where the peasants had ventured westward in search of grazing and farming land, they were met by angry Muslim Trit XS of the Tigray, namely, the Beni Anwar and the Shalioase Orda. It is in light of these contradictions in the country that Ethiopian intervention in Eritrea and the role played by the Ethiopian crown can appreciated between 1941 and 1952. Ethiopian crown and Rhekbasa. It must be noted that the same historical trends that made possible the formation of the African states also made possible the creation of the Ethiopian Empire State. The only difference is in specific details. In the other African countries the imperialists ruled directly through tier device of colonialism. With the exception of a brief, 1935 to 1941, they ruled Ethiopia indirectly by what is now known as neocolonialism. Given this difference, the formation of the Ethiopian Empire and the Eritrea state coincides with the period of the scramble for Africa in the Berlin Conference, Highwet 1975. The argument that Eritrea was part of Ethiopia for centuries has, therefore, to be viewed as a mystification because Ethiopia has, in fact, existed in its present form only since the 1890s. In this instance the development of a global capitalist system is essential to comprehension of the point under discussion. This is to deny the existence of cultural, linguistic, and religious affinities between the Kebesa and the Ethiopian highlands, especially in the Tigray region. Before the Italians, the Kebesa was under the diocese of the Abuna, bishop, of Tigray for ecclesiastical purposes, Travasky's 1960:13. The Coptic Church was tier carrier of the high culture. Each village in Kedrza had 20 to 30 priests and the church in local villages transmitted the same teachings. It was the only school where government officials and other functionaries of the ruling class came from in traditional times. It was the single most powerful ideological institution, whose influence was felt in every village of the highlands of under Italian order. The Coptic Church in Eritrea was forced to sever its ties to the Ethiopian Coptic Church. Furthermore, as we have noted, the Italians broke the economic power of the church by confiscating church land and converting it to crown land. The Ethiopian crown exploited the situation to the fullest. By promising the return of church lands taken by the Italians, the emperor made the Coptic Church the center of Ethiopian ambitions. By 1942 every priest had become a propagandist in the Ethiopian, every village church had become a center of Ethiopian nationalism, and popular religious feast days such as Maskil, the Feast of the Cross, had become occasions for displays of Ethiopian patriotism. The cathedral, monasteries, and village churches would be festooned with Ethiopian nags, and the sermons and prayers would be delivered in unequivocal political language, Travasky's 1960:60. To begin with, the Meklealil, the Tigrayan serfs who settled in Eritrea and who were the most affected class in the rural area, strongly supported the Ethiopian cause through the church. Further, the peasantry, and even more intense hatred of foreigners, especially in 1942, the solid under the influence of the church. Rural discontent unified in religion. Peasants, facing economic distress, found salvation in religious unity. The unity tck anti-Muslim coloration. Brilliantly cultivating the fias as aspirations of the Eritrean rural population. The Ethiopian crown gained a FOCRH01D in Kedreza. However, it could only a temporary victory by emphasizing such a retrograde, and the crown created a contradiction it was incapable of resolving. The western lowlands, the rule of Italian capital in Eritrea, had an equal character and differed in influence from region to region. Relatively faking. The western lowlands were not as heavily as those of Kedreza regions. Although as pervasive, nevertheless, the colonial rule unleashed an irreversible that was shaking the caste structure prevalent in the lowlands and northern highlands of Eritrea from its foundation. The Ital-enb lycée of combined direct and irregular rule was to expedite the of the Verdot San at Y by means of MO and RNR traditional fetters. To this end, Italians worked to conserve rural class structure and social organization so as to use the nobility to safeguard their interests. While in the highlands this was somewhat successful, such a was difficult to apply in the IOW lands ticos of differing social and economic circumstances. Nevertheless, the Italians to ****anti-it. The lowland res were ****1tly dominate by a livestock economy. Because of the introduction of modern and scientific techniques of livestock breeding and health care, we have that the of livestock increased considerably in the 1940s. This a tremendous effect on the rural society, especially among, since the serf had an absolute right over grazing land and his pro-FFLY, including livestock. They allowed the serf to increase his wealth, and sort v serfs did thx. Since obligation of the serf to tier chief was defined, and since dues or services existed from the serf are fixed, and not the potential to accumulate wealth was restricted by tradition or custom, Nadal. Furthermore, the role once played by the nobility as the protector and guarantor of safety of the serfs was increasingly taken over by the Italian. Hence, as far as the serf was concerned, the traditional office of the nobility was becoming obsolete. As a result, the role of the chiefs was by the new rulers serfs incentives to strict observance of the feudal with it, NANL 1945:85. Serf also ***gan to occupy positions up by the colonial modes of production. The nobility became the victim of its own traditional pride, and the nabtab made use of these rare opportunities than the serfs, just as the tribal not *I was less prepared to develop his infrty and wealth, NAKL 1945:83. Nor could the nobility fall bxk to the traditional ways of accumulating wealth. With the presence of the Colorado Nile B. Lycée Amaratus, the infrequent raids by the feudal nobility became difficult if not invisible. It is against all these odds that the Italian colonialists ughed so hard to preserve the influence of the traditional chiefs in the rural community, while the economic base of the nobility was destroyed. TTX Italians worked hard to preserve its political influence because they wanted to rule the peasantry through this caste. By 1934, the Italians went as far as paying some of the influential nobility with a fixed salary and preserved the chief's position by transforming feudal rule into a responsive office, Nadal 1945:86. Same was applied in the Northern Highlands, Misawa region, and other whose social structures were similar to those of the Beni Arner society. By 1941 the Italian and feet cut short Italy's political agreement in tip rural areas of the Tcathern Highlands and the Western Iowlands. The influx of ex-soldiers returning to their homes further exacerbated the situation. From 1942 to 1945 there was sporadic and protracted raids and counter-raids involving the Beni and *R, the Naden Down of Sudan, and the around the Gash Seti areas. Here a legendary Beni Amer leader was bombed. Ali Mohammed Idris, nicknamed Ali Muntaz or Ali the Corporal, was an ex-soldier of the Italian army. The influence of Ali Muntaz became widespread, his power multiplied and he had a steady now of arms and ammunition. Encouraged by Ali Muntaz's exploits, armed rebellion and warlordism nourished in the lowlands as far south as the Borodars of Ethiopia and north to the Sahel and Massawa provinces. Travasky's 1960:71, peasant discontent and insubordination engulfed the western areas. In the northern coastlines, the Tigray serfs of Adtikle initiated a serf resistance that was to influence the serf population throughout the Tigray-speaking population. The Adtikle serfs challenged the traditional system and the ruling socio-economic structure by refusing to pay customary dues or taxes to the nobility in 1942. By 1946 the British administration found itself faced with a situation where 9/10 of the Tigray population were in resistance to the remaining aristocratic 10th, Travasky's 1960:72. Noting that the serfs were united behind this cause, the British suggested a compromise solution. They ruled that the nobility should retain their political authority, but might not enjoy dues and services from the serfs unless these were voluntarily conceded. Travasky's 196,071. It must noted that unlike the Italian solution of 1935, the British did not convert the traditional feudal ransitions into recognized and salaried political offices. In the final analysis, this solution was not a compromise but an outright surrender, since to deprive the nobility of their right to dues was to strike at the foundation of aristocratic and chiefly authority. Travasky's it is precisely these contradictions that encouraged the Ethiopian government in its mobilization efforts to attract and win converts to the Ethiopian cause. This region, however, was unlike the Ket*SSA. In the Highland Plateau Ethiopia had used historical reasons, exploited religious sentiments, and cultural affinity to rally support to its union with Ethiopia cause. To this the ruling class of Ethiopia recruited the Coptic Church to their but there was no great tradition or small tradition to *AK of in the lowlands. The serfs, Muslim only by name, Nadal 1943:1945, made up 90 of the society. They were not Volume 6, Number 2 Horn of Africa 157 primarily fighting outside enemies but ruling classes. By 1946 the little support Ethiopia had in the highlands was slowly fragmenting. It was essential, therefore, to augment these by influencing and winning migrants to unionist cause in the lowlands. In the absence of conditions, the Ethiopian envoy in Eritrea, the colonial Nega Haile Selassie, found time to tour the Muslim areas and make arsenal with most of the chiefs and shumagals of the Tigray tribes. Travasky's 1960:75. Through a combination of direct bribes and future promises, the Ethiopian crown was able to win the lowland nobility to its cause. The prospect that the crown would reign endless and enforce FET-clal obligations and a caste structure in the rural areas greatly appealed to the nobility of Tigray. The Ethiopians had led and sponsored a party which had been founded in 1942 and changed its name from Maber Hager Fikri, Association of Love of a Country, to Eritrean Ethiopian Union Party, to be known as the Unionist Party. The Unionist Party attracted ex-feudal lords from western Eritrea. Though predominantly Christian at the leadership level, the party attracted the ex-ruling classes of Eritrea who had lost or were in the of losing their privileged status with the envelopment of underdevelopment during the Italian era. The church hierarchy and the nobility of highlands and lowlands. basically those who exploited and appropriated the F*A.sant surplus in labor in kind congealed themselves as a force and Tivgan to support the process of the return of feudalism with the full sub-T of Ethiopia. Kabesa and Lowlands, Assessment. The British Peritonel, 1941-1945, was crucial. FCV Eritrea as a political unit, FM. It is then that Ethiopia, supported by the US, began to in the internal affairs of the country. Yet British colonial administrators and their ABIIologists have saluted England for successfully politicizing Eritrea and initiating literal democratic paraphernalia, Travasky's 1960, Natal 1943, 1945, 1946. This is debatable, since the fact remains that England, weakened by World War ILM, confronted with the rise of nationalism in its colonies, neither Hul 58/Horn of Africa Volern 6, number 2 the capacity, the strength, the class INOBGY to think in terms of welfare of its natives in Eritrea. Is that Eritrean political agitation for change was inevitable and was objectively necessitated by Italian colonial conuslictions and of fascist Italian immerxrealism. By the Italy was and feet. Its nationals living in Eritrea totaled 70.000. British did little to alter Italian created and run administrative institutions in Eritrea. The Italians still them. Further, the enlisted Eritreans fighting the fascist war atroid were returning in thousands were fully med. Worse, the and feet SIG nailed the termination of WX related ethnicity in the country. By 1941 1/5 of the total Eritrean population had urbanized. Wick Tray Market was Revglajivk. The rural pheasants been grafted into an acropolis economy were and are standably affected. The Siduxian in 1941 was, to say the east, art volcanic. With contradictions, the obscene mixed. The revolutionary in of the 8 in Eritrea. More than 95% of the population lived, Italian and Ital, Zesipital Chale changes. In the first PLXE, it is note that in Eritrea, feudalism in its classical FMM, its Ethiopian Vigayant, had in the Christian highlands, however, the COR*IC church owned very valuable lands and got frek vesa la nx tinks its culti in the lowlands, chiefs owned serfs and TTX status of the serfs was abhorrent. In TVTH the Christian highlands and tier Muslim Italian colonialism had altered this nascent by direct intervention and by the impact of capital in the highlands. Church Lerwy was confiscated and converted to Italian crown land. Sown was cased and were given to Italian church as an economic force was totally castroid. In Lola MSVille 1940s brought to an end serf su and ordination serf obligations to TFX chiefs. This was a enrental revolution in a country where has always teen divict against itself by feuds and conflicting interests, there now emerged a real union emtonacing all the Tigray. Seeing this, the Bariya of Gush Seti, who resemed paying dues to their chiefs, and the clans, who feared domination by Naib of Misawa, hasted to ally TTKMSE Ives with Tigray, serfs, Travasky's 19,073. However, in the Highlands Church, no longer power still exerted subrestructural i.e. tier ecology of the masses still remained that of Christian. In the lowlands was quite different. Here, infant feudalism existed primarily as an economic force. With emancipation of the serfs, the political economic power of tier lowland chiefs was made in cases, with the peasants freed from economic enendage, the power of the church of Thai chiefs virtually destroyed. But it is true neither the ruling class nor their ideas die that quickly. With L***Litical Chas of 1941, tie of these ruling interests and the strengthening of feudalism was psic. Immediately after Thai Italian and feet, a tier R which became an official political party in December 1947, made every effort to revere hist y. It is known as the Patriotic Association for the Union of Eritrea with Ethiopia, Unionist Party. It was initiated and sponsored by ETHP and governed Arndt's cultivated allies, namely the Coptic Church and the chiefs of the Muslim lowlands. The party's four-ruling fathers and active members who already secured, by the early 40s, important high offices in the Addis Ababa-based Ethiopian government, Nar *Li of Amos director of the Ethiopian M1 Post and Telegraph, and His Majesty's Minister of Pen. The main objective of Unionist put a conspirx y of old and emerging ruling was to cultivate support among the masses for its Unionist cause. In return, Ethiopia restricts to the church and chiefs their lost economic and political power, and through royal intermarriage, etc., RNAE them part of Arn's Ofetsial ruling class. The Eritrean Covmic Church was the agent for this conspiracy. It began intimidating peasants, threatening to excommunicate them, refuse them holy services to baptism and burial if they did not support the Unionist cause. But the more the conspiracy took shape and the more it became exposed, the heads of the church increasingly relied on anti-Muslim paranoia and hysteria to gain support for a union with Ethiopia. With this, the fragile and unholy alliance created between the chiefs and the heads of the Unionist party collapsed. And the church temporarily succeeded in forming anti-Muslim Christian solidarity for the Unionist cause. With the partial success of the Unionist a counterparty articulating the interest of the IOW lands, the Muslim League, 1946, was formed. Although the founding fathers of this party were composed of merchants, ex-serfs, and past functionaries of the Italian government, and at the beginning articulated the interests of the serfs, their political goal increasingly became definable relative to the Unionist Party. Earlier, spurred on by the successful revolts of the serfs, the political organ of the Muslim League categorized the Ethiopian government as composed of the old worn-out feudal system and subsequently blamed the government neglecting the welfare of its nationals who are in such a state of disorganization, ignorance, and backwardness that they have had chronic poverty despite fertility of the land and the privilege of Inderenkru, FPCR 1949:103. The party's political goal was to secure independence for the lowland provinces. It increasingly became a sectarian political organization, allowing the chiefs who had defected from the Unionist Party to infiltrate into the party organization. Finally, in the summer of 1946, the hostility between the ruling class of the Unionist Party and the new rulers of the Muslim League erupted into the worst political war in the history of both Asmara and Eritrea. Temporarily, the Ethiopian government was able to divide the Eritrean people and especially the peasants by setting fire amid the ruling classes, and by appealing to the sanctity of the Ethiopians' official religion. Conclusion: after 60 years of basic change that had taken Volume 6, Number 2 Horn of Africa/59 place in Eritrea, the conditions for the emancipation of the peasantry were generated. To say the same thing differently, as a result of capitalist colonialism, the affairs of the nation were no longer under the direct control of the traditional rulers. The material base of pre-colonial production relation changed. In little more than 6 decades, the old reality of master/serf subordination that had existed for centuries came to an historical halt. With the generalization of commodity production and the commoditization of African latar, the process of forming a collective national identity due to the common colonial excurrence had taken root in the country. Revolution, Marx noted, is a qualitative change from one of PR selection to another. The disintegration of RVE colonial class relation was a revolutionary experience for Eritreans. Capitalists' induced transformation became the base out of which Eritrea was to unfold as an eco-emitical unit. The elite polities of the Eritrea *T failed to appreciate this. Though yonder of this essay, and we have shown elsewhere, it can easily be documented that one of the major weaknesses of Eritrean Liberation Front was its inability to handle the peasant question properly. The EPLF, on the other hand, not only understood the profound transformation that had taken place in the rural area but went one step further to guarantee tier PVS rights achieved in the 1940s and introduced new OTVS which solidified support for the IND-FMKNCE and liberation struggle of the nation. Without rural mass support, no revolution can succeed in Eritrea. It is for this reason that the unrestoring of the social basis of the revolution, namely the profound transformation that has taken place in Eritrea during colonial capitalism, is so central to Eritrean and politics.